Okay, and we are live. I'm here with Frank Tufano. He has a small YouTube channel. I believe you follow the carnivore diet, right?
That depends on your interpretation of the carnivore diet. Uh,
So, do you eat like a zero carb, all animal products diet?
yeah, for the most part. Yeah, I do. In the past few weeks to months, I've experimented with raw milk and raw dairy products and stuff like raw honey that does contain some carbohydrate content to some degree, but strictly animal foods.
Okay, all right, close enough. I'd call that carnivore diet, really. I know typically carnivore diet, especially like today in the last few months, it focuses around skeletal muscle tissue, and
Yeah,
very
that's
few people actually eat organs.
no.
And there are problems with that. So, for today, I wanted the debate to focus around the health consequences of a diet like this, the carnivore diet, or
Mhm.
whatever you'd call it that you're following. We'll discuss things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer. I know you wanted to bring up nutrient deficiencies among vegans or something. And
That's a very like it's not a topic that's been researched extensively, and just the bioavailability of those plant nutrients in general is it's tough to really have a definite answer on that, but we could definitely discuss it.
okay, why don't we start there then?
Yeah, sure. So my idea is that you know in if we look at indigenous diets or just basically what humans even in the past 100 years, if we go back 100 years, what pretty much every group of humans had to eat was a base amount of animal foods in their diet to get these vitamins, and then they would consume whatever foods were local to the area, whatever plant foods they had access to prepared in traditional ways. So maybe if you were in Sweden, you would have rye bread with various dairy products, occasionally meat, and maybe some whatever seasonal vegetables or protein had. So the premise is that every group of these humans needed these fat soluble vitamins from these animal foods in their diet. And that was constant across all planes of people, whether it was dairy, whether it was fish, whether it was some form of meat, whether it was like the Australian Aborigines, where they literally had like hundreds of different wild animal foods as well as thousands of different wild plant foods. The one constant is that they got a base amount of fat soluble vitamins in their diet. Now, what becomes questionable is we have access to through modern science and modern food accessibility, foods and supplements and things that we never had access to before. So that's where it gets really questionable about the bioavailability of those supplements, and if we could actually replicate that nutrient profile in a vegan diet. But the overall problem with this idea is most people don't understand the importance of having a nutrient dense diet, and most people don't really place a value on these fat soluble vitamins. So the whole premise is based off of something that not many people are confident in or place an importance on in their diet in general.
Okay, like 100 years ago and further back than that, vitamin D deficiency and iodine deficiency was incredibly common among Americans.
Yeah, among Americans, but I'm mostly referring to when there were still kind of groups of almost untouched people not on American diet.
You mean like tribes people or hunter gatherers?
Yeah. Like, I don't really want to reference Weston Price's book here, but that's kind of those groups of people I'm referring to, like people that are still
Well,
living like off the land, so to speak, not really city people or
when you reference Weston Price, you're not actually like he was a dentist, so I'm
yeah.
assuming you mean like the type of people he studied, not like
Yes,
his
I'm
actual.
referencing those specific groups of people and the diets he saw those people following.
Okay. You don't think any of them ever suffered from nutrient deficiencies?
Not necessarily. Very each of those tribes had to they had to go out of their way to get certain, like in the case of iodine, that there were some African tribes that would gather seaweed and burn it to ashes and use that to get their iodine. And a lot of tribes would literally they'd fight over certain sources of food because they had deficiencies and they needed to get these whether it's a vitamin or a mineral. What did you mention? Iodine and what was the other one you said?
Well, I said vitamin D and iodine. Like those were two big ones.
Yeah, I mean that
In
can. I
terms of
mean, yeah, I mean not everyone had access to those like the fish liver and the those fish organs and tissues that contain large amounts of vitamin D3. So, not every. That's why we see there was varying height differences between those tribes, and even in some cases, a lot of them had very very high infant mortality rates where the child could not get enough nutrition during the younger years. Uh, I'm not denying that they didn't. I mean, it's not that they didn't have nutrient deficiencies. It's just that in the ideal context when they were able to obtain the food they needed, they were in good health.
Okay, do you have any evidence that nutrient deficiencies were less common among these sorts of tribes people compared to modern times?
I mean, that's a very broad question. I mean, you
No,
would
no, I
literally have,
mean,
yeah, I mean, you'd have times where if like, and I've read, and this was when I was reading like some articles about the Aborigines and their like very kind of, I guess, not so moral practices and in like times when of famine, if they gave birth to a child, they would literally take that child. They would, I mean, they'd kill it and they'd feed it to their other children. Very, very apparent, just things that happen in nature. Where animals go for weeks and months without food, or uh, things happen and the crop wasn't good. There are plenty of examples of nutrient deficiencies in indigenous groups, but for the most part, when these people were in excellent physical health in a lot of cases, except for those specific examples.
okay, what metric are you using to say they're in excellent physical health?
Mainly physical facial development, physical stature, overall absence of degenerative disease.
Absence of degenerative disease. According to the heart,
Before they are introduced to a modern diet,
okay,
or what? Not necessarily modern diet, but before like refined foods and their indigenous foods are replaced.
Atherosclerosis has existed in every population all throughout human history. You should take a look at the horse study. Even pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations had atherosclerosis.
So there is a difference
Um,
between the plaque buildup and calcification of arterial walls.
they're both
Those
dangerous.
those people actually from what I don't know if I read exactly what you did, but what I'm thinking in my mind, those people literally had fat marbling in their arteries, which
Yeah,
had nothing to do with inflammation.
yeah. That's because they're eating high amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol, or at least enough to cause the buildup of atherosclerosis. Are you trying to suggest that calcification of these plaques makes them dangerous, and when they're not calcified, they're not dangerous?
I mean, do we want to go into like what causes why heart disease is actually caused? Like
Yeah.
the
Like, is that
okay.
what you're suggesting
So
here?
uh just repeat what you just said.
Are you trying to suggest that calcification of these plaques is what makes them dangerous, and they're not dangerous when the plaques aren't calcified?
No, I mean it's mainly the inflammatory fats and uh oxidized fats, rancid fats. Uh I mean this is not like a blanket statement I'm going to make. Like I'm in regards to just how explaining how heart disease is caused, and it's like literally like a 20-minute explanation to get people to understand that.
Okay, well, no, you agree that ancient people, including pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, developed atherosclerosis, correct?
So atherosclerosis, the definition of it being the buildup of fats, cholesterol, and other substances in and on the arterial walls.
Yeah.
I think they use a different terminology. I mean, I don't have that. I don't have the. I'm just trying to think of what the reference was where they actually like, because there's a difference between the physical having marbling and that in the walls that's not inflammatory versus the actual, like what this definition of atherosclerosis is.
Okay, are you talking about stable versus unstable plaques?
No, I'm not. I'm talking.
Like,
I have to. Let me just do a
there's
Google.
like I understand there's different degrees in atherosclerosis progression. Like, are you saying like their atherosclerosis wasn't severe?
I'm saying the type of atherosclerosis they had nothing to do with inflammation and was not harmful to their health.
What? So atherosclerosis isn't harmful to your health unless it's causing inflammation, quote unquote.
We're not talking about. That's the thing. We're not talking about. I'm not talking about atherosclerosis. I'm talking about the type of marbling they had in their arteries. Or
What do you mean by marbling in their arteries?
just one sec. I'm reading. Do you have the you said the horse study
Yeah.
that you were mentioning?
Let me find a link for
'Cause
you.
this is like a really specific, like this is a super specific topic that uh I didn't look into the specific references.
You should read the study Atherosclerosis Across 4,000 Years of Human History, the horror study of 4 ancient populations, and they found atherosclerosis even in pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. I don't know what you mean by marbling along the arterial wall. That's atherosclerosis. When you have fatty streaks going across the arterial wall, that's atherosclerosis. It sounds like you're kind of confused with different
What's the
sorts of
title
terms.
of the horse study?
Okay, let me just
It's
get
like horse study.
Atherosclerosis Across 4,000 Years of Human History, the horror study of 4 ancient populations.
What were they? Do you know the ancient populations off the top of your head?
Let's see. Ancient Egypt, ancient Peru, ancestral Pueblones of South Africa, and the Unagan of the Aleutian Islands. Yeah, of the Aleutian Islands.
Okay, let me just. Do you have the? I
Do you
just
want me
have
to just
the. I
link
just
you
have
the
the. I just
text?
no. I have the abstract. I just don't have the full data. Uh,
Okay, well, you don't really need it. They did find atherosclerosis in all of these mummified remains. The point being is
this has
these.
nothing. But I don't know what their diets were. I don't know anything
Well,
about these people to
that's
speculate on
that's
them.
fine. Well,
That
that's
has,
fine, but you're making like that's fine. But you're making the claim that ancient hunter-gatherer populations they were in great health, they didn't suffer from chronic
this is
disease.
not ancient
And
hunter gatherer. This is 4,000 years of ancient,
that's
and
ancient.
you can, and for
That's
certain,
pre-agricultural
ancient Egypt
hunter-gathering.
does not have ancient Egyptians, and especially in this period,
They weren't hunter-gatherers. I
they were
agree.
no, they're very far from that. This is Neolithic. This is not really. This
No,
study is
well,
not
they
relevant.
had
Well,
they
the
had
problem I have, which
pre-agricultural
I just
hunter-gatherers.
didn't want to, I didn't even want to really go into this because your point is speaking on the modern medical terminology of atherosclerosis, but if you're saying that, okay, let's hypothetically say that, okay, let's say atherosclerosis was present in these hunter gatherers. Even if it was, what what is like, do you have like a reference for them dropping dead of heart attacks? Like, I don't understand where you're going with this. Even if I
Well,
do, even if I can, which it would probably take me a few minutes of Googling, I don't, maybe even more than a few minutes. If I probably have to ask a few of my buddies if they know what the study I'm referring to was. Even if I can prove that there is a difference between the marbling and the arterial walls of certain indigenous tribes and hunters, like, let me see if I just Google Maasai.
okay, it sounds like you're confusing mortality from heart disease with actual prevalence of the disease.
No,
Um,
I'm saying the I'm saying that atherosclerosis, even if these people did have marbling in their arteries, whatever it may be, what is your, like, I don't understand, what's your end point? Like, we know
no,
there's an
my point is you're trying to claim these people were in great health. They didn't suffer from any chronic diseases when they did.
I mean, they didn't suffer from degenerative diseases, and they didn't have
Okay,
any
well,
modern
what do you mean
problems.
by degenerative disease?
I mean, it's interesting because if you get like, there's this guy on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about how when these monkeys started eating garbage, they developed tuberculosis very rapidly over the course of a few generations and died. But it's interesting that we see groups of indigenous peoples that whether it was European settlers or people from the countries that have subsisted with like these diseases for periods, these populations were literally, even though they were in perfect health and on their indigenous diets, they were completely wiped out by certain diseases.
Yeah,
So
that's because they didn't
that,
have close proximity to animals. They didn't have agriculture, so they didn't actually get used to these diseases. They didn't have that immune system built up, so they got wiped out.
yeah, I mean, I'm bringing that up. Is that those are the diseases you're referring to, or are you referring
No,
to
I
just
was
like
I was
heart
talking about
disease and
atherosclerosis specifically, and I still don't understand what you mean by degenerative disease. You mean like Alzheimer's?
yeah, degenerative
Okay,
disease. I
well,
mean,
nobody lived
Alzheimer's,
long enough to even get
diabetes.
Alzheimer's back then.
I mean, do you understand that any sort of study done on an indigenous group based off of mortality, if like, are you saying they live to 30, 40 years old only? That's life
Well,
expectancy.
no,
That's
that was
not
the average. That is affected by infant mortality, but that was the average. And
these, if you, any like sort, if you look at any sort of tribe, indigenous, aborigines, there are plenty. I mean, the majority of these people, barring getting stabbed with a spear, live into, I mean, what's your measure for life? Like, we have people dropping, we have babies getting cancer, we have women miscarrying at rates higher than we've seen before. We have all these modern problems and degenerative diseases with young people dying. And
well,
now,
explain
I mean,
degenerative disease. I'm still not clear what you mean by that.
all right, let me, if you want me
Like,
to say specific things,
well,
we're
just
talking
explain what you
about
mean by degenerative disease. Like,
degenerative
is it
disease,
Alzheimer's?
any
Is there anything
disease
else?
that are kind of modern in a sense that any disease that has raised over the past, 40, 50 years, from obesity to diabetes, arthritis, Alzheimer's, all of those diseases for the most part that uh, we can speculate are caused by modern lifestyle, modern diets, and things like that.
Okay, well, things like diabetes, it is largely affected by body mass. If you're obese, you're at a massively increased risk of diabetes. Physical activity affects it. So I wouldn't expect to find high rates of diabetes in hunter-gatherer populations, even if they're eating a lot of animal products, just because they eat so little calories, their body mass is so low, and they have so
my
much
my
physical
my
activity.
overall
But
point in this is, if there were consequences and any problems that we're seeing now from what your atherosclerosis things you're claiming, where is any evidence that these problems occurred in these groups of people? There isn't
well,
any.
again, horse, like the horse study I just referenced,
That's not
every human
that has
population has had atherosclerosis. The
that
thing
that's
is,
past four. That's not That's 4,000 years. Neolithic period
no,
is
there's
what, like
still
12,
pre
13,000 started.
well,
This has nothing to do with
listen,
what I'm talking about.
listen, just because a certain group of people entered the Neolithic age and started agriculture, that doesn't mean every human population practiced agriculture around that time. Again, if you
That's
take a look
I
at the horse
said with
study,
this study that you keep saying, the horse study. I don't have the whole abstract. I can't read, and I'm sure that they didn't even write down what these people were eating. You don't know those things. You
how would
can't
they know what they're
speculate on
eating?
that. That's my point. This study doesn't matter.
Well, they're
You're
still
saying
pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer
this
populations.
is not. This has nothing. You don't know. You're saying ancient Egyptians, ancient
I'm not
Peruvians.
saying ancient Egyptians. No, some of the
No,
African
Ancient
populations
Egyptians, ancient
pre-agriculture.
Peruvians, ancestral. We don't know the diets of these people, and I can't look at the date.
Well,
This is not.
no, but the point
And
is they're
even then,
pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations, not the Egyptians, but the Africans.
but they're lumped together with these other people. Like this study is
They're not
not.
lumped together. They looked at their rates of atherosclerosis in these mummies, and the pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations still had atherosclerosis.
I'm saying three different things pretty much about this study that I think makes it inadmissible. From the lack of data I have to analyze this, we shouldn't even look into it further. Two, hypothetically, even if they did have atherosclerosis and problems, what is your end summary? That they just had atherosclerosis? You don't have anything about, their life expectancy, the disease rates of these people, what they died from. You don't have that data.
No,
And
it's just
this
simply
is
looking at
not
rates of atherosclerosis.
this is pointless. This is like,
No, it's not.
I shouldn't have even got, yes, this is exactly pointless.
Why
You
is
don't
it
have,
pointless?
because if you actually wanted to talk on something specifically like this, it would take like an hour or two of just looking at the data of the studies and trying to make
Well,
sense of it, as opposed to just
no,
making a
no.
blanket statement about atherosclerosis.
Frank, I'm not like I don't think you understand what I'm saying. You're making the claim that pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations didn't suffer from chronic diseases like heart
I'm not
disease,
making, I'm not,
diabetes.
I'm explaining to you that if you want to prove that this, and I have to be apparently very specific, if you want to prove there is some sort of detrimental effect of atherosclerosis or any, I'm not necessarily saying that. I'm asking you to prove that your idea of atherosclerosis and all these saturated fat things, where is the body count? What is your basis? This going into this discussion, there
What do you
shouldn't be any.
Sorry, Frank, you're conflating mortality from heart disease with prevalence of the disease. If we were to go back 100 years ago in this country, heart disease, deaths from heart disease would be massively reduced just because prevalence of death from infectious disease was massively high. So if you were to go back like 4,000 years and look at these ancient hunter-gatherer populations, they probably had a high prevalence of heart disease because they ate enough saturated fat and cholesterol to build up plaques in their arteries. But the rates of deaths from the disease were very, very low because one, the life expectancy wasn't long enough for heart disease to actually become like clinically significant where they'd actually suffer heart attacks. And they just die from everything else, from infectious disease, warfare, injuries, things like that, and nutritional deficiencies, which I'm sure were quite common, as you admitted to, because these people did have to rely on just the food they actually gathered.
So
So it's
you
very
so
dependent on seasons.
you're completely basing this off of the life expectancy that you're referencing.
Well,
That's what you're
they
basing this
did
off.
have a lower life expectancy, and that's part of
You,
the
but
reason.
you can't just say they did have a lower life expectancy. You have to
Well,
say,
they
you
did.
have to show the data and say why they had a lower life expectancy and
Well,
the
a
causes
huge
of death.
factor. Well, the biggest factor is child mortality,
Yes,
and I
but
think a huge
infant
factor of
mortality.
child.
So infant
No,
mortality means that their speculative age is what, 60, 70, 80 once they passed that developmental stage.
so,
That is the problem with child
well,
mortality.
listen. There's two ways of measuring average life expectancy. There's a way where you include child mortality, which does obviously, like especially in these populations, it skews it more towards a much younger age, and you can calculate it by life expectancy once you reach a certain age. I think normally it's 12 or something.
But
I think when
you
you
can't just
use it,
say, you cannot say these people had atherosclerosis and the reason they didn't die as a result of it is because they didn't live long enough, when you
yeah, I
can't
can.
actually furnish information
I
of
absolutely
this
can.
life expectancy.
I
You can
absolutely
say it,
can.
but it has no
Um,
merit because you
no, it
don't
does.
have a study on the life expectancy and what the context is.
Well, what do you mean? Like, even if we go back 100 years,
You're just,
mortality from heart disease
what is your
massively
reference for
reduced
life
because of
expectancy?
infectious disease.
What is the data that you're looking at for life expectancy? What is that data you're talking about?
Well, look, Frank, life expectancy has increased in modern times. That's just an indisputable fact, even when you account for
Okay,
child
okay, hold on.
mortality.
Let's move on to another topic. I'll ask this one more time. If not, let's move on to something else. Your basis is on that they didn't live long enough. But what, like, study or what article or what are you referencing for the life expectancy that you're saying? What group of people are you referencing? What you're just making up numbers. That's what you're doing.
Okay, no, Frank, I'm not referencing any particular research here. It's just well known that pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations had a lower life expectancy, even when
Because
you account for
no,
child
no, not
mortality.
no. When you
No,
with
even when you account for child mortality. You're saying they lived just as long as we do today?
if if that period of developmental period, the child mortality was passed, they
Yeah,
would
that's what I
live
said.
to 60, 70, 80. There's, and
I
this is
believe I believe
many.
it ranges from 55 to 65 depending on the group you're referring to.
And then in it, so let's say that that is the hypothetical. And then you're saying that then they would have died from heart disease if they did live. So where's all the history of these people that did live past child stages and people that didn't get killed? You're saying all of them, every single person in all of these tribes was killed before they had the chance to die of heart disease? That's a
No,
very
not every
ridiculous
single one.
But so everyone that got to 70 would just instantly drop dead of a heart attack. That's what you're saying.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying prevalence of heart disease existed. It's just that it didn't develop to the point where it's clinically significant.
And I asked you like 3
in
times,
most
where
cases.
is the, where's the body count? Where's the, like, the problem is both
Well,
what
wait,
I'm
wait,
saying,
wait.
both
Hold
what
up for
I'm
a
saying,
second.
hold on. Both what I'm saying and both what you're saying, honestly, at this point, there's no real merit to it. And I'd like just to move on to another topic because we're both making statements about data that we're not 100% sure on and that we can't reference. Can we move on to something besides?
Okay, well, no, this is actually kind of important, Frank. Like, I want to know what you're actually trying to claim here. Are you trying to suggest that pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations had the same average life expectancy as modern humans, even when you account for infant mortality?
All right, let me see if this answers that question. And we're not really even talking about pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers. We're talking about people that were still living in almost like a primitive way where they would have, maybe they weren't completely hunter-gatherers like indigenous aborigines subsisting only off of wild plant and animal foods. Maybe they were a group of people like maybe the Gaelics who had 50 to 60% of their calories from fish, and then they had a lot of oats and various vegetables that grew in that area. Maybe like this group of people that once they, and this is a group of people that might not have had such high infant mortality problems, but once they got past that stage of child development, once they got past that, then they would live a happy, healthy life. Pretty much it. Let me see if I could find a study, I think off the top of my head.
Okay, Frank, the point I'm trying to make here is heart disease did exist all across human history in every population, even when you look at pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers.
All you can say,
The argument you can make, no, listen, let me finish. The argument you can make is that they had lower rates of deaths from heart disease, but that doesn't really matter. They had a lower average life expectancy and a higher risk of death from things like infectious disease, injury, malnutrition. Literally every other thing was more likely to kill you from heart disease than heart disease. And part of that is because of their overall diet and lifestyle. Like now, you can become incredibly obese, eat insanely shitty processed foods. So, typically they wouldn't develop heart disease as quickly, but it still occurred. And what I'm arguing
this is fucking comical, man. Your whole basis for this argument, they dug up a bunch of 4,000-year-old mummies and looked at their arteries. Are you nuts, man? This is completely fucking ridiculous. I'm not talking about this anymore if you're using this study as a reference for this.
Okay, Frank. Did heart disease exist in ancient populations, yes or no?
I mean, you don't have evidence for it. I don't have evidence against it. No, you don't. That is not evidence for it.
The horse study I just referenced is evidence for it. They had atherosclerosis in their
arteries. If you want to keep referencing this study, I have to know
it's good research.
What these people are eating.
It doesn't matter what they were eating. No, Frank, it's completely irrelevant what they were eating. The fact is, ancient populations had heart disease, and we know
these are not any groups of people that I would talk about or I would reference on my side of the argument. That's why I've been saying for the past 20 minutes, we should move on to something else. If this is the studies we're going to talk about, and if we're just going to like hypothetically speak about things, like, to me, this is pointless. It really is.
I just want to make it clear that heart disease has existed in every human population throughout history. Doesn't matter what their diets were, whether we know their diets. The fact is, heart disease has been prevalent all throughout human history.
With this shoddy research that's been done on
shoddy.
Mummy,
what do you mean? They found mummified remains and they X-rayed them and they found atherosclerosis. How is that shoddy research?
So what are we gonna? You want to like fly over to Egypt? You want to dig up a few bodies and start looking at their heart from like 3,000 years ago? Like this is completely to me, this study is just completely ridiculous. And
why?
Even if on the premise that
sorry, Frank, listen.
You're making a statement on some mummies dug up 3,000 years ago and applying it to everything in the past before that.
Look, Frank, Why is that a bad way of determining prevalence of heart disease in ancient populations? Do you have a better
Oh my
method of
God.
research?
You're using the term ancient populations, and you're saying, and this is a study
4,000
done.
isn't ancient?
This is still in the Neolithic period. This is not,
4,000 isn't ancient?
I mean, what, depending on whatever your definition of ancient is, but I'm not talking about ancient mummies. I'm talking about various indigenous groups that
Yeah, and
followed these diets,
Frank, do you know
and we
what
don't know.
mummified means?
Yes, preserved
Well, you
for the most
can
part.
well, no, listen. Mummified just means it doesn't mean there's been some sort of human intervention in preserving the corpse like with the what the Egyptians did. It just means it's remains of a human being that have been preserved in any manner. Like in Africa, for instance, like you can find mummified remains that have just been buried in the sand, and because it's so dry, their
I know
bodies
what
have been
fucking
really well
mummified is. You
preserved.
don't have to like.
Right. So Frank, I'm just asking you, do you have a better method of trying to figure out the prevalence of atherosclerosis in these ancient populations than digging up mummified remains and seeing, like, doing CAT scans or X-rays and seeing, or MRIs, and seeing whether or not they have atherosclerosis in their arteries?
Dude, my point is this, like, this whole idea, and I think I've kind of explained this loosely over the past 30 minutes. It just, this is not something that's relevant. You're taking this,
Well, it is.
you're digging up people from 4,000 years ago. You don't know what they ate. You don't know what their
Doesn't matter.
lifestyle
Doesn't
was.
matter.
You don't know, you don't know what diseases they were dying from. You can't use this.
That
Like,
doesn't matter.
this is
Frank,
completely ridiculous.
Frank, that's completely irrelevant. The point I'm making is these ancient people, including pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations, had high prevalence of atherosclerosis.
But you're
Doesn't
lumping,
matter. It doesn't
you
matter what
cannot
you want to.
lump, you can't lump pre-agricultural, which would be over 12, 15,000 years ago, with
Not
this study. That's
necessarily.
completely crazy.
No, no, no,
That's
no, no,
that's
no,
completely
no, no.
ridiculous.
Frank. Not every single group in human history was at the same level of technological advancement. For instance, what Rome was using Bronze Age technology well before another group that
Dude,
actually lived pretty
there's
close to
still
them. They were still using Stone Age technology.
there are still indigenous civilizations now. I think they're off the
Yeah, there are.
coast of whatever. But that's
And
not the point. Is the point is what I'm saying? What in my mind, if you want to say this, you would have to have a specific reference from a period of time. And my point that I'm staying with is all we're doing is speculating with information that is not correct. That's all we're doing right now on this
What
topic.
information isn't correct?
If you were to say to me that in these four specific people, ancient Peruvians, ancient Pueblans, these four specific groups of people within the past few thousand years, and we don't know how old this corpse was, how old these people, like, we don't.
Well, they do. There are methods of determining what
Yeah,
age.
but I don't. The point is, I don't have the data. You're not giving me specific examples and going in depth on this data. We don't have anything we can really reference and make something reasonable out of it. You're just making the statement
Frank,
saying that in these specific people within the past 4,000 years have atherosclerosis. Okay, that doesn't apply to really what I'm talking about. That doesn't apply. You can't say that applies to all indigenous people. You cannot say something like that.
Yeah, you can. When you look at
You can, but it wouldn't be
from
correct.
that long ago, from very different backgrounds, there were pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, and there were people from Neolithic era populations like the Egyptians. They all had high prevalence of atherosclerosis. So it's very safe to assume that every other population in human history has suffered from atherosclerosis. And this is the best data available. The only way to look at atherosclerosis prevalence in ancient populations is to find mummified remains, do an MRI on their corpses, and see whether or not their arteries are clogged with atherosclerosis.
This has nothing to. This literally does not matter because it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You're just bringing up something like this is not a point I would talk on. Like, I'm not disagreeing with you that I'm not disagreeing with I had atherosclerosis for these mummified remains from 4,000 years ago to now.
Okay, well,
I'm not disagreeing. I'm saying that it's pointless to talk about this.
Frank, is there any population in the world that doesn't have any amount of atherosclerosis prevalence?
What can you
Modern or ancient?
I'm not talking. We've been talking for 40 minutes about this bullshit topic, and we've really kind of come to this is just a waste of my time. It really is. Like,
Okay, well, no, Frank, you were trying to claim that these people eating a traditional diet, quote unquote, that were mostly hunter gathering, they had really low rates of disease. And I'm trying to point out that's not the case. They have high prevalence of atherosclerosis. So
but
clearly, what they were eating was causing them to have disease. Now, whether or not they died from those diseases is a different thing, but they did have these diseases.
you're saying these groups of people had atherosclerosis, but the study you're showing has nothing to do with the people I'm talking about.
Okay, well, do you have any evidence that the people you're talking about did not suffer from atherosclerosis?
This is the burden of proof is not on whether or not they had atherosclerosis, because you're doing studies on people that you don't know what their diet is. That is the whole basis of me explaining this, is that they're on a particular diet. So
Okay,
if you're
right.
not able to
So,
tell me what the diet is, if you're not able to tell me specifics, then
well,
there's
Frank, okay, show me like a hunter-gatherer population or whatever population of people you want. Show me that they don't have like atherosclerosis or it's incredibly insignificant among their culture.
I wish I had time to do this instead of spending Googling studies that I don't know exist.
Okay, Frank, I
You
think at this
know,
point it's very safe to assume that atherosclerosis has existed all throughout human history in every
no,
culture.
because the
Yeah, it has.
atherosclerosis existed in the mummies your buddies dug up for the past 4,000 years. That's what you're saying.
Okay, well, do you have any evidence otherwise? Like, again, this is the only evidence we have. The only way to measure atherosclerosis prevalence in ancient people is to dig up mummified
Uh,
remains and see
oh,
whether or not
I
atherosclerosis is
got
in their
one thing
arteries.
here
Okay,
that
what?
I just Googled. I've never looked at this before. Abstract is the hearts and aorta of 50 Maasai men were collected at autopsy. These pastoral people are exceptionally. I'll link. Is there a chat in Google Hangouts that I could just?
Yeah, there is. Let me
It's
see.
right here.
It's
Here you go. The meat
atherosclerosis
intake
of the
of,
Maasai.
do you want me to read it, or do you want the meat intake of animal fat exceeds that of American men? Measurements of the aorta showed extensive atherosclerosis with lipid infiltration and fibrous changes, but very few complicated lesions. The coronary artery showed intimate thickening by atherosclerosis, which equaled that of old U.S. men. The Maasai vessels enlarged with age to more than compensate for this disease. It is speculated that Maasai are protected from their atherosclerosis by physical fitness, which causes their coronary vessels to be capacious.
Yeah, okay.
Next
So
study,
so
just one
again, they
second, one
have
second.
heart
Let me just
disease.
one
Frank,
second.
they have heart disease. The study you just linked me
Qualification
admits that they have high prevalence of heart
overriding
disease.
protective mechanism such as freedom.
And
So my
you
so
should also note,
this is what I was this is why I was asking you earlier, that you need to show what why these people aren't dropping dead of heart. Like, there's no data showing that these people were dropping dead
Frank,
of
it
heart
doesn't
attacks. There's no.
matter.
It
Frank,
does
it
matter
doesn't. No,
because
no, no, Frank. What matters is prevalence of disease. There are a lot of different things that can modulate deaths from disease, including life expectancy and rates of death from other illness, but they do have heart disease.
I feel like people are gonna feel like this has not been productive so far. So can I try to like just explain what I think you're trying to get at, and then what I'm trying to get at real quick?
Sure, sure.
So initially, my point was to kind of say, okay, yes, they have atherosclerosis and buildup of arterial plaque in the wall, but it would be very difficult from our modern understanding of medicine to explain why these people are not dropping dead of heart attacks. But they evidently were not, despite modern evidence saying that atherosclerosis does cause heart disease. Now, for me to say something like in this study that says the Maasai vessels enlarge with age to more than compensate for disease, for me to say that
They
these
have disease
people are
prevalence.
yeah, for me to say that these people are immune to the disease is not really, to me, that is not like, to me, a marketable or like something that would be something that people would just take for granted, as the atherosclerosis and the heart disease and the plaque buildup in the arterial wall has been something that's been shown in such a negative light, especially in the context of modern medicine. Whereas it's something that would, in these people, it occurs naturally. They have and they have no problems with it.
Oh,
And
well, they do. It's just that typically the enlargement of their blood vessels compensates for this. Also, again, higher prevalence of disease in other aspects like infectious disease. It might modulate their risk of death from heart disease. You also have to consider, like, these people have a very different lifestyle. They eat very low calorie diets. They also use a lot of medicinal herbs and medicine, and they also often suffer from infectious diseases, including things like malaria. And that does affect risk of death from heart disease because a lot of these diseases actually reduce serum cholesterol.
Yeah, there's like there's a group of people that are like immune to malaria, right? As well. You hear about
Not
that?
completely immune.
Well, no, I mean they have it, but like they don't really suffer from it.
Well, it's because of sickle cell anemia. A
Yeah,
lot of
that's it.
Africans have it. So yeah, like I mean, there's adaptations in these sorts of cultures to the diseases in the area. But I mean, that also can modulate the risk for some of these diseases. I mean, okay, the Maasai, their blood vessels widen somehow with age. That could be a genetic thing. That could be an effect of like their specific lifestyle of eating a very, very low calorie diet
But you
and
have to
having.
understand most of the all of these indigenous groups that I'm referring to subsisted on what we eat now, if not less than the amount of calories we eat now, and they were all similar in regards to their levels of physical activity and physical stress that they had to maintain their lives. I mean, the constant between these people that are immune to these diseases is those factors.
They tend to eat low calorie diets, and they're also often infected with parasites and infectious diseases, particularly malaria. And those two things reduce serum cholesterol. And serum cholesterol is the principal risk factor for heart disease. So again, like you can reference these tribes people all you want, but you're not really understanding their real diet, lifestyle, disease prevalence, and how that affects heart disease risk. Again, like looking at the Maasai, you can't just say, oh, saturated fat and cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease because the Maasai eat a very low calorie diet. They have a proportionately high amount of physical activity, very low body mass, and they also often suffer from infectious diseases and parasitic infections. Like that claim just doesn't make any sense. So
In regards to if the only way that wouldn't make sense is if the parasitic diseases you're referencing and the the malaria and stuff, which wasn't present in these people specifically, we can I don't know if we could assume that, but it's if those
Maasai, yeah, I
parasites
believe
and
they do
those.
suffer from malaria.
I mean, I don't know if that's a blanket term for all Maasai, but those previous factors you mentioned don't really matter because those can be replicated. But the malaria, if the malaria and the sickle cell thing was proven to be literally the only reason why they're alive, then that's a different discussion to be had. But if that can't be said, then it doesn't really, like I mean, from like what is the point of you saying that these people were on like a low calorie diet that was restricted because
Well,
are you
eating a low
implying that
calorie diet reduces serum cholesterol.
are you implying right now that just if people followed a carnivore diet now they're just over consuming way too much meat and this isn't relevant? Because I agree with that if that's the
Um,
case.
no, my problem is if you're eating any, like pretty much any amount of meat, you have to be on a very, very strict plant-based diet to not cause progression of atherosclerosis. And especially if you're on a very heavy meat diet like you are, even if you're eating things like organs and things other than skeletal muscle, your intake of saturated fat and cholesterol is way, way too high, and you're causing buildup of plaques in your arteries, which will eventually lead to like clinically significant heart disease, where you're going to have an increased risk of heart attack, stroke.
So let's say hypothetically I replicate the exact lifestyle of the Maasai with the exception of having sickle cell anemia and
Well,
parasitic infections.
they don't all have sickle cell, and sickle cell is actually a big risk factor for stroke.
Well, I mean, so let's say I do replicate the lifestyle and diet of the Maasai. Would you believe that I would develop these conditions where I would be
You
pretty
would.
much, you think
Uh,
so?
Even the study you just referenced, it said they have high prevalence of heart disease. It's just that as they age, their vessel walls enlarge, I don't know why that happens. I'd actually like to see other research on this, but you would still get heart disease. They like the study you referenced yourself says they have very high prevalence of heart disease. It's just that a lot of them get away with it because of confounding other confounding factors.
So why would that not apply to my diet right now? Why would I mean?
You don't have the same diet and you don't have the same lifestyle.
I mean, how sure of that are you?
Well, do they eat cheese? Do they eat steak every day?
I don't. I mean, I should have made one thing very clear before this. I follow pretty much. I mean, my diet, if you compare it to a Maasai diet, it's pretty much the same thing. It really is.
I've
Whereas,
seen daily, like I've seen a few of your food vlogs. No, it's not.
well, what I ate yesterday was I had I stewed the vertebrae of lamb, and then I had a little liver and some other organs, and that's all I ate. Small amount, active all
Sorry, you
day.
you ate lamb, liver, and what else?
The vertebral column, the spinal cord, I boiled it down in a pot with and then just had the meat.
So you ate lamb, skeletal muscle tissue, you had liver, and the
Well,
spinal
you
cord.
know, I mean, most people don't. I mean, people don't really eat that vertebral tissue. It has a lot of collagen, a lot of high vitamin fat. There's just tissues in there that would be kind of. This is something that like a tribes person would eat. And then the day before that, I just had a bunch of organs and some blood, and that was really it. But my diet for the most part has been majority. I have organs every day. Majority of my calories come from fairly lean. Uh, well, not majority of my calories, but roughly half my calories come from skeletal meat. And in the past, I used to have a lot of raw dairy too, as that. So I would say my diet is very, very different than what most carnivores and zero carb people are following.
Well, I'd agree with that. I'd still say it's quite a bit different than the Maasai. They like their primary calorie source is milk and blood. They tend to avoid killing their cattle,
Hmm.
and they do occasionally eat steak and shit. And they also do consume medicinal herbs
Hmm.
in their region. Um, but the point is, their diet causes heart disease. So why would you eat a diet that causes heart disease? It's just that for whatever reason, maybe it's confounding lifestyle factors, or maybe they have some sort of genetic, like a genetic resistance to the disease where their arteries will actually expand. They get away with not dying from heart disease at a very high rate, but the prevalence of heart disease is extraordinarily high. So why would you eat a diet like that when there's ways of just like avoiding heart disease entirely?
Well, I can answer that in a sec, but I did want to ask you what would be, you're saying the Maasai get a lot of their, yeah, they do consume a lower calorie diet. They do get the majority of their calories from much more nutrient dense foods, but what would be the concern about? I mean, yeah, I mean, I obviously agree that eating, 2, 3 pounds of grain fed ribeye from Costco is completely ridiculous. But in just regards to like, what would be the reason specifically that you think that would be uh, so much worse, just in the context of diet? Like, let's say you took a Maasai tribesman and he just ate the grain fed steak a day instead of what he was eating. Why would that be? I'm just trying to, I
I'm
mean,
not saying it's necessarily worse. I'm just saying, like these diets that are high in saturated fat, cholesterol, they cause
Mhm.
heart disease. And the research you linked to me demonstrates that they have very high prevalence of heart disease. So why would you eat a diet that causes heart disease when you can avoid it entirely by eating a relatively low fat whole foods vegan diet?
Well, I mean, what I spoke about earlier, where every group of people had a base amount of fat soluble vitamins in their diet in order to be in what I would consider have proper physical development, proper physical health. It's just that base fat. Are you like me, like more like personal, like me, why I do it, or as opposed to like just like, because right now I'm trying to explain why someone would do it as opposed to just me personally.
No, why would you or anyone eat a diet
Okay,
that's high
okay.
in saturated fat and cholesterol, which has been proven to cause heart disease, when you could avoid heart disease entirely?
Because those are the only foods accessible really in nature that have the vitamins and, well, mostly vitamins required to just survive. That's basically it.
Okay. So what nutrients can you not get on a vegan diet, and would the lack of these nutrients actually reduce or sorry, increase like all-cause mortality risk to the point where it's more worth it from a health perspective to eat a diet high in saturated fat and cholesterol, which causes heart disease, as opposed to eating a vegan diet, which lowers your risk of chronic disease, but supposedly you won't get enough of these nutrients, and that'll cause health problems.
So, I mean, this goes back to what I said earlier about, now we have access to modern supplements and extracts of these certain vitamins that can be used on I mean, I've literally never seen a vegan that takes all of these supplements, but I theoretically
What
we could,
supplements do I need as a
uh,
vegan?
yeah, I mean, theoretically we could replicate. I mean, under the assumption you get vitamin D3 from the sun. Uh,
Well,
vi-
listen, virtually every group of people is vitamin D deficient.
yeah, I agree
Um,
with that. You're talking about now,
so,
right?
sorry?
You're talking about like now.
I think it's existed all throughout human history.
I
Maybe
mean,
there were
that's
some few exceptions,
why,
but
why would you think? Why would you think people who spent like 5, 8, 10 hours a day outside a day were vitamin D deficient?
oh, like there are being studies on friggin' Californian surfers, and they're still vitamin D deficient. And they spend all day in the sun, like almost naked.
I mean, but a
Vitamin,
Californian surfer is not like, so you need other vitamins and minerals and things to metabolize vitamin D3. It's not just
right,
it's
I
not just
understand
getting
that,
D3.
but it's not very reliable to rely on just the sun for D3. And that's why there's a massive prevalence of vitamin D deficiency, especially with people who have darker skin. Think in the United States, like 83% of blacks have vitamin D deficiency. So it's just a good idea to supplement D3.
I
And
agree. Yeah, I mean, I agree.
why?
I agree
And
with.
Frank, here's the issue. Let's say like the certain fat soluble vitamins, you can only get it from animals, or you take
Mhm.
a supplement.
Yeah.
Why is the supplement worse than eating the animal products that also come along with saturated fat, cholesterol, which increases heart disease risk?
Yeah, I could speak on each of them individually. So, vitamin D3. I'm not. I don't. I looked into what the vegan version of D3 was made from, and I
It's
honestly
made
couldn't
from
figure.
like a type of fungus. I
It's a
think it's
type of
called.
fungus, but yeah, that's to me that doesn't make sense because I didn't know that. I thought D2 occurred in fungus. I didn't realize it was D3. But
D2 occurs in fungus, but there's also a certain type of fungus that produces D3.
yeah, so I mean, in the case of like D3 made from these foods or lanolin, sheep's wool, you have to use hexane. They have to use solvents to extract the D3, and then they use a carrier oil. And I usually just rub the oil on my skin, so I don't necessarily think that the the supplements are too harmful. But what I've noticed, I've personally had insomnia problems when I just take a supplement uh,
What supplement?
without the presence of the other fat soluble vitamins.
Okay,
Um,
so what supplement are you talking about?
just any like D3 and in any sort of olive oil or whatever.
Okay.
I mean, what's the, what? I mean, I'm just curious. What's the? I mean, the D3. I agree with you, and I think everyone should supplement D3. So, do you want to just
Okay.
move on to the other vitamins?
Well, yeah. I remember you mentioning on Twitter, like when you DM'd me, you mentioned vitamin A in particular.
Yeah, so vitamin A in the form of retinoic acid, to my understanding, the only supplement that comes close might be retinol palmitate, and it retinoic acid is used. We know it's used for a lot of just cell functions in the body in general, and we know that the body does convert carotenoids to retinoic acid at various rates depending on the food in the context that a small amount of saturated fats are present, but nothing to me indicates, either from my personal anecdotes with consuming large amounts of carotenoid foods with fat and studies that I've looked at. Uh, and the problem I have is that it's questionable. We don't really have data showing, we know some groups of people can't metabolize the carotenoid to retinoic acid at all. And we know that this form of retinoic acid in humans is just incredibly important for health in general.
Okay. Do you have any research showing that vegans have a higher prevalence of vitamin A deficiency than meat eaters?
I mean, it's not necessarily about, in this discussion about vitamin A, it's not really about deficiency. It's about, having a high vitamin A content can kind of just help optimize just your whole metabolism in general. And I mean,
Okay.
humans store fat soluble vitamins in their liver and their tissue. So I think to answer that question, we would have to literally have data on, the liver, the vitamin A stored in the liver of a vegan versus different people. We'd need data to kind of
Vegans
figure that out.
have lower vitamin A status, but they don't have lower rates of vitamin A deficiency, and that's not associated with increased prevalence of any type of disease. Your
Yeah,
body,
but
listen, well,
the
no, listen, let me finish. Your body regulates vitamin A production because you need a range of it.
Mhm.
Too little is harmful, too much is harmful. It can cause liver problems and also bone abnormalities, and it's especially a risk for women because they have a higher risk of bone diseases. But your own body synthesizes vitamin A, and it regulates vitamin A production.
but
So
all
why would
those
so,
liver problems and those
well,
bone
wait, listen,
diseases.
listen. Well, listen, let me finish. So why would you take like a fully formed source of vitamin A and consume that to ensure that you're not vitamin A deficient when your body regulates this process very well on its own?
You
So you're
you
increasing risk of having too much vitamin A in your system.
you mean what you're saying? You mean consuming like liver is a risk for too much vitamin A, whereas if you just get the
Yeah,
plant form, your body will regulate it properly.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so my problem with that is and let me just find my studies on it. Uh, any all that those bone problems, the liver problems, all those things you're associated with vitamin A toxicity are actually with the plant form supplement. Those are not with. There's the case
Plant
there.
form supplement.
Yeah, that's what you're referring to.
No, vitamin A. So vitamin A supplements are either come in the form of fully formed retinol, or they come in just the carotenoid form. The carotenoid form isn't dangerous because again, your body has to produce the fully formed vitamin A itself. The
My point
fully
was that
formed,
all those things are associated with high vitamin A supplementation. That was my point.
yeah, typically, but most people aren't eating liver every single day.
Yeah. So my point is that any case there has never been a case of or any data showing that consumption of and there's plenty of people on this diet that consume pounds and pounds of liver per day, and they don't illustrate symptoms that these people do where
Okay, do you have any
they
research?
take
Because this
supplements.
is sounding like anecdotal claims.
Yeah, I have it right here. So I made a post on. I'm gonna link this to you. I made a post on Reddit showing several hypervitaminosis A studies in people that took plant forms versus people that consumed carnivorous fish liver. And when they consumed the carnivorous fish liver, it was symptoms actually associated with heavy metal poisoning as opposed to the actual hypervitaminosis A. And there has been no research that I've been able to find that indicates that your body will not be able to regulate excess intake of vitamin A. But this isn't, I don't know how relevant this is just to my idea that high vitamin A consumption through retinoic acid is beneficial for overall metabolic function. That would be more
Okay,
difficult for me to prove outside of anecdotes.
like I'm just quickly looking over the studies you linked me. This is all with like case reports where people were consuming vitamin A supplements. Do you have like anything in the form of maybe like do you have case reports involving like just very high liver consumption or maybe like a randomized trial ideally?
The only thing in on the first part of that, the first link, let me just double check. The first link in that post is the carnivorous fish liver reports. That's all that's really there.
Wait a
But
second. Okay, the first link I saw was a pediatric case study where a child was just consuming a toxic amount of vitamin A through supplementation.
uh, let me just. You mean 23-month-old Chinese girl presented to the emergency room with vomiting, irritability. She had consumed 4 pieces of fish liver the night before. That's not what you're looking at.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So this is acute vitamin A toxicity from consuming fish liver.
Well, we don't know if it's necessary because those are also symptoms that they showed from that you could get from copper toxicity as well.
Her grandfather, who ate the fish liver, had similar symptoms.
Yeah.
Is fish high in copper?
Well, no, carnivorous fish liver is very high in heavy metals, and the point of this showing this study that ingesting carnivorous fish liver is not a good idea is that carnivorous animals accumulate incredibly high amounts of vitamin A and copper and these metals in comparison to normal ruminants and normal livers that we would be eating, more along the lines of dozens to hundreds of times higher. So by looking at this and what happens to these people that consume this carnivorous fish liver, if hypervitaminosis A was possible on a zero carb carnivore diet, we would see these symptoms in people more often.
Okay, there's acute toxicity and there's chronic toxicity, and they're both harmful. But this seems like fish liver causes acute toxicity, where it's much harder to do with something like beef liver.
But you have people literally consuming on this diet. I've seen people eating half a pound to a pound of beef liver a day for months,
Okay.
and there's no evidence that
Like
the li-
again, these are anecdotal claims. I'd like to actually see a case report or something at the very least.
I mean, I'm in the, I'm in the same boat as you. I know the liver does regulate. I mean, you said earlier the liver regulates your vitamin A intake, but I mean, my own, I don't know why I went into this. The only real point I had was that there are benefits to consuming high vitamin A that many people see, and this is again completely anecdotal. Uh, just because vitamin A in the form of retinoic acid is used in so many metabolic processes, and the liver has a version of it that's more available to the body. But to me, this wasn't really.
Okay,
Th-
listen. This like really ultimately comes down to overall health outcomes. Do you have any evidence that consuming vitamin A through carrots or sweet potatoes is less healthful than consuming it through something like liver, like beef liver?
it's not necessarily that it's less healthful. It's just the bioavailability in a lot of contexts is questionable about how much we
Well,
can actually.
bioavailability is like it's a throwaway term. What matters is whether or not you're getting an adequate supply of vitamin A. There's no data showing that vegans have like higher rates of vitamin A deficiencies compared to meat eaters. And the point being, like, are you really telling me that sweet potatoes and carrots aren't as healthy as beef liver?
Well, that's a very different question because beef liver is pretty much nutritionally complete. But the
Yeah,
reason
it's nutritionally complete. You can have something that's nutritionally complete, but it's terrible for you.
I didn't want to touch on this. I didn't really want to debate this. I just wanted to bring up it was more like bringing it up and possibility because I said earlier it's very difficult because of the lack of data we have to talk about these things. I just wanted to bring them up as kind of an idea more as opposed to actually debating on whether or not it's necessary because I don't have an answer for that and you don't have an answer for that. uh,
Well, yeah, I do. Vitamin A prevalent, or sorry, prevalence of vitamin A deficiency isn't any higher among vegans, and things like carrots and sweet potatoes, they're protective against chronic disease, whereas something like beef liver is not.
Or then I mean you could say that, but by answer I mean something based off of evidence. I could say something like, well, beef liver has a much higher retinoic acid content that is bioavailable to the body. So whether or not you're getting a questionable amount of vitamin A that's ideal for the body is out of the question. You're definitely getting plenty of vitamin A, and then your body can deal with whatever excess you have. And I believe that
Well,
that's important for being optimal in regards to metabolic function and health, and that the RDAs for a lot of things are inaccurate, and that most people would see a benefit from higher retinoic acid consumption. Would be my answer to that. And our answer.
listen, where's the evidence that high vitamin A intake in the form of fully formed vitamin A, where's the evidence that it's beneficial?
If you just want to talk about like what it does in the body, retinoic acid is.
I know what it does in the body. I'm just saying, why is vitamin A intake that bypasses your own body's regulatory mechanisms, why is eating a super high amount of it beneficial?
Retinoic acid is still regulated. It still has to go through various forms before your body utilizes it. And the whole premise of this was retinoic acid has a lot of functions in the human body. It's very, very important. And
Well, Great,
The
but
idea is
why is it a good thing to eat a super high amount of it? Like it's bypassing your body's regulatory mechanisms. Again,
no, it's not,
normally,
because
yeah,
your body
it
regulates
is.
retinoic acid.
Well, it is. Again, you can suffer from acute and chronic toxicity from it. Like if you don't get if you don't get acute toxicity from vitamin A, you can also get like chronic toxicity where it causes bone abnormalities. And
Oh.
chronic toxicity can occur at intakes only 2 times the daily RDA recommended intake. So it's pretty low. Again, like I'm not seeing any evidence that eating a super high amount of vitamin A is at all beneficial. Like again, vegans don't have a higher prevalence of vitamin A deficiency. I don't see any evidence that a super high intake of vitamin A, where it's at the point of chronic toxicity, would be at all beneficial. And again, like these foods you're talking about, carrots and sweet potatoes, are a lot more healthy and they protect against chronic disease, whereas liver like causes chronic disease.
As I said twice so far, these were things that I just wanted to bring up and speculate on the bioavailability of it, and saying that, okay, if you eat liver, you're certainly getting enough of these vitamins, so there's nothing to be concerned about. This wasn't a debate of whether or not it's important to get these super high levels of vitamin A, because there's hasn't really been studies on that, and there's no way for me to prove outside of anecdotes that it's important to
Okay,
but it
so
does not. Retinol does not bypass regulation. It needs to go to retinal, and then it needs to be oxidized to retinoic acid. It does not beta carotene. It's you consume the vitamin A from the food. It goes into retinal, then retinoic acid. Then your body can utilize it. Carotenoids, it's an extra step. It's not necessarily retinoic acid in the animal foods is not necessarily bypassing. Beta carotene requires an extra step.
well, it is. Again, if you're not suffering from acute toxicity, you can suffer from chronic toxicity, and chronic toxicity occurs at only twice the RDA, recommended daily intake.
Well, since I only have the anecdotes of myself eating up like 2 pounds of duck liver a day for a week, let's try to put
Well,
that on the
you know
back
what?
burner.
You know what?
And
I'll link you this paper, the acute and chronic toxic effects of vitamin A. I think you should actually read that because chronic vitamin A toxicity is quite common. It happens at only twice the RDA intake. You can think you're completely fine, but this can cause problems like bone abnormalities later in life. So you should actually read that because you're like I don't even know what you're trying to say here. Are you just trying to say, well, if you eat liver, you'll get enough vitamins? Like, who cares?
no, the overall idea between bringing up this vitamin thing is that even in the context of people on the carnivore diet, they would see a lot of benefits in energy and overall metabolic function from consuming a higher amount of vitamins in this bioavailable form. Now, the thing is, I guess something else to bring up would be, okay, let's say you get your sweet potatoes and your coconut oil, and theoretically you can metabolize it, but where in nature would we see these carotenoids where we can metabolize them in our digestive system in a natural way? Like, how would you actually and I know this doesn't really apply because we have modern methods and modern science and supplements we can use to try to replicate this, but where in like a natural setting would we see the possibility of getting carotenoids present with fat from a vegetable source that's available to pretty much all groups of people?
Okay, well, Frank, you don't need to consume like an overt source of fat immediately when you eat like provitamin A carotenoids to convert carotenoids into vitamin A.
Yeah, but where would you be getting a non-animal source of fat as well as a large amount of
Nuts, seeds,
carotenoids in every group?
algae. You really don't need much fat to be able to absorb these fat soluble vitamins.
So you're telling me that someone is going to have
And
access
grains.
for a full
Grains
the
are.
problem is, well, grains are out of the really kind of out of the picture, because
What do you mean out of the picture?
to get the fat content of a grain, would that even be the right? It has to be saturated fat, to my understanding, to metabolize the
No, not
carotenoids.
necessarily. And like there's a small amount of fat in some grains too.
I know that for sure,
And
but
there
I
are
don't.
nuts and
But that's
seeds
not.
like
But
algae.
the term I said, accessible to all groups of people, and that includes climate at various parts of the year. So obviously things like nuts and grains and
Frank, like,
algae
what
not
does it even
available to
matter?
every.
Like,
No,
Frank,
I
what
mean,
does
it was
this
just
even
some.
matter?
It was
Vegans
just
don't have a higher prevalence of vitamin A deficiency.
because the point was that you can't obtain vitamin A in nature at in various
Who
different
cares?
locations and at various points of the year. It's just something to think
Okay,
about from
great.
our, because
Like
you're
we can't.
referencing,
Well, Frank, like I mean, who cares if we can't get it in nature? It's clearly ideal for health.
well, like I say, who cares about studies done on mummies 4,000 years ago? And
Because it
those
shows
people.
that disease prevalent, like the prevalence of heart disease has, like, there's been a high prevalence of heart disease all throughout human history.
But now when I say that since we can't get carotenoids in a natural state and humans would have never obtained them from carotenoids and fat in this way, then it just doesn't matter. Is that what you're saying?
No, like again, all I really care about is reducing risk of chronic disease, being healthy, or living longer. Why would I care if some like primitive proto-human couldn't get vitamin A from a carrot?
Because every indigenous group required vitamin. I mean, vitamin A was present in all of these diets, and in the case of like studies done on pigs, if an animal is vitamin A deficient in birth, I mean, there's obvious vision problems. Without They're
I
born
really don't
without
care.
eyes.
Vitamin A
They're
deficiency doesn't occur at a higher rate among vegans.
No, but the point is that in nature, you wouldn't have enough vitamin A to survive on a vegan
Great.
diet.
I don't care, and that's a dubious claim to begin with.
Uh, so So, I mean, for the most part, I do agree with you. I agree that vitamin D3 can be supplemented. I think that in the context of an optimal vegan diet, the vitamin A should not be a concern. In regards to the vitamin K2, I mean, that can be supplemented as well. And what's the other?
Well, wait a second. Are you claiming vegans don't get enough vitamin K2?
I mean, depending on the fermented food intake, it varies between vegans.
Okay, so between fermented soybeans like natto, which actually has one of the highest amounts of vitamin K2 you can possibly get from any food, or like what's high in K2, like grass-fed butter or something, or
Are you
liver,
asking like what the
what's
K2 source in
healthier?
animal foods is? Oh, what or what? Like I was just
Yeah,
bringing up.
between natto, which is a source of K2, and something like grass-fed butter or beef liver, what is a healthier source of K2?
There's a different MK change like MK7, MK4, and natto is MK7, which needs to be converted to MK4. So in liver, it is I mean more available in that context, but the body can still convert it. The only reason I brought up the K2 thing was because it's just like the carotenoids, it's present in nature only in animal foods, whereas now we have modern versions of foods that we make that we never really saw before to obtain the vitamin.
Okay, vitamin K2 is produced in your gut by your gut bacteria, which is why it's virtually impossible to suffer vitamin K deficiency as an adult. And yeah, it is present in fermented foods like natto. So why would you eat something like beef liver or butter rather than getting K2 from natto if you're concerned about K2?
Because you're isolating food that is very specific to one part of the world that is can be very inflammatory to some people and that some people are allergic to and cannot consume. And some people don't even like it.
Okay,
It
yeah,
grosses some people out.
some people are allergic to soy, and some people are also allergic to animal products. So what does that mean for, like, I'm talking about the general population.
Because overall, if you're saying, okay, vitamin K2 is in literally like 20 animal products I can list versus only pretty much one source that's a vegan source or it needs to be supplemented, people would start to question about, you know, okay, if all of these vegan things I need to supplement or
You don't
take
need to
from a very
supplement
specific,
K2.
well, no, but if all these vegan things either need to be supplemented or neither either need to be obtained from a very specific food source that could not really be practical for all parts of the world and every person, how can you? It's hard to justify the nutrient availability and density of these people's diets.
Well, I don't really care what people think is more convenient. I care about what's healthier. Why is it healthier? If you even think this, why is it healthier to consume K2 from something like liver or grass-fed butter as opposed to natto or take a supplement?
Because you get the different MK chains. I mean,
Okay, Frank.
that'd really be the only reason.
Okay, Frank. The research on K2 is very mixed. Positive findings have only come out of one single country,
Mhm.
and the majority of research is showing that K2 intake is associated with a higher risk of heart disease, and that's because generally people are getting their K2 from things like butter, liver, terrible foods that increase risk of heart disease.
I think, I mean,
Again,
the main reason I brought up K2 was because it's important for the calcium regulation in the body, and
I know that.
a lot
I
of
know that, and that's
people.
why.
I'm just saying this
So
for the stream. I'm saying this because I think that a lot of people, especially on the standard American diet and the carnivore diet, consume too much calcium without K2. And so that's just something I wanted to bring up, not necessarily in
okay,
the context of vegan versus animal.
well, Frank, so K2, it's not picked up, it's not filtered out of your bloodstream like K1 is, and it bonds to a specific protein that carries calcium, and that's why it's sometimes associated with lower risk of calcification in the arteries, which is like a huge risk factor of like
Mhm.
mortality from heart disease. But the thing is, there have been mixed findings.
Mhm.
Positive findings have only come out of one country. I think it's the Netherlands, if I'm not mistaken. But there's studies that have been conducted in Germany where K2 intake is associated with heart disease. And the reason for that is likely because people are getting K2 from terrible sources like beef liver, butter, and these foods cause heart disease. So the take home message here is you should look at the overall health effect of these foods and overall diet and not just focus on like these specific nutrients. So quality of food really matters here. If you want to get K2, then you should get it from natto or take a supplement. Like you're much better off than eating something like butter, which has been proven to literally clog your arteries and
But
kill you.
you're basing everything you just said off of a study that you said was done in Germany showing that higher K2 does what? Is
It
associated with
increases
what?
risk of heart disease.
But that's just you're saying higher K2 increases risk of heart disease, but natto is much higher in K2 than any of those animal foods they would have likely been eating. It's literally 10 times higher. It's multiple times higher. It's
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
higher.
So why wouldn't you just eat like K2 from soybeans when the K2 is higher for one thing, and fermented soybeans don't increase risk of heart disease, whereas things like butter do?
But why would you say you should eat a food that has 100 times the amount of K2 and then say that higher K2 is associated with heart disease? That just doesn't make,
No,
and then
no,
try to
no,
relate
no.
it. But
You're
you can't say
misunderstanding
that and then
me.
relate it to, you
You're
can't.
misunderstanding
No, I'm
me.
not. I understand what you said. You said
No.
it was the food they were
Let me
eating.
clarify. Let me
You said
clarify
it was
for you.
because of their diet and the foods they were eating, right? That's what you
Well,
said.
let
It
me
wasn't
clarify.
necessarily the K2.
Well, let me clarify for you. K like the majority of the time, people are getting their K2 from animal products like butter, certain cheeses, like liver, shit like that. So when you do a population study on K2
Did you
intake, what
have
you're
that
really
study?
doing,
I'm sorry. Did you
sorry?
have that? Can you link me that study
I'll
real quick, or
actually link you
let
a
me see if I
big
could Google it.
article. Well, I can link you a big article on vitamin K, and the research links are in that article. But positive findings have only been coming out of one country. There might be like multiple like confounding factors and reasons for that, but research in other countries has shown K2 intake is associated with an increased risk of heart disease, and that's likely because they're eating more foods that cause heart disease, like butter, like liver, garbage like that. So K2 intake, like among the general population, with like these common foods like butter, cheese, liver, it is associated with heart disease in research coming out of every other country. But like the mechanistic data suggests that K2 is protective against heart disease. So again, the take-home message here is that you should get K2 from good quality plant sources
Well,
like
I'm sorry.
natto or take a supplement.
What was the you said? Do you know what country the study the K2
I
was
that
in
it was
where they said it was beneficial? You know what
I
country that was?
believe it was the Netherlands.
Okay, so I'm looking at a study right now that says a problem with K2 can be interactions with various medications. Like
Okay,
because vitamin
sure.
K2 is essentially an anticoagulant. So we would assume that if a country has higher, rates of taking certain medications, that if they have that vitamin K2 intake would be associated inversely. So I think that's a pretty good explanation for
So
why we might
so
see problems with vitamin K2.
So wait, how does it interact with a medication where it would increase risk of like death from a heart attack?
Well, that's the no, but
Because it
vitamin K2
sounds
vitamin K2 works as anticoagulant, and it's
right.
very important
So
for blood health. But there are medications that kind of work against. I mean, I'm listen, man. I'm not a biochemist. I can't explain that specifically. That was
right.
just a
Well,
study I looked up.
that makes sense, but again, like this just shows more than anything that you should be careful with supplementing K2 or even intaking K2 from any source. So this isn't really a good argument for eating animal products.
No, but that could be an explanation of why
Right.
those people,
Okay.
why there was an association with the K2 and
R-
the increased mortality or
Right,
whatever
but
cardiovascular.
given how the data is currently mixed and these foods like butter, cheese, liver, they're high in saturated fat, cholesterol, and heme iron, they've been proven to increase risk of heart disease. Why would you eat those sources of K2 when you can get something like natto, which has way more K2 and it's not associated with chronic disease?
But then we have to just move on from K2 because you're saying other things are causing the problem.
What do you mean?
If you're saying saturated fat, cholesterol, and all the other and heme iron and all the negative things in the animal foods are the reason, then we should just move on and discuss those individually as
Okay.
opposed to focusing on
Okay, sure.
K2.
I'd love to.
But I guess I could just mention. I mean, there are plenty of other vitamins that are, uh, and the other vitamins outside of A in the form of retinoic acid, D3 can be supplemented or obtained from animal foods, and K2 can be obtained from, as you said, the natto and then animal foods. All the other vitamins are present in both plant and animal foods, and
The
that
so the problem here, Frank, is you can look at like mechanistic data and shit all you want. What ultimately matters is health outcomes in a population. If you're going to claim that like provitamin A carotenoids aren't like they're not changed into fully formed vitamin A, converted in your body very efficiently, like okay, well, what are the health outcomes of that? Like you haven't shown anything that like you haven't shown any evidence that vegans have higher rates of deficiencies in these sorts of things, if it's a direct result of their diet, and if it's actually caused a significant overall impact to their health. Like, do vegans have a higher risk of a particular disease because they're not getting enough of a certain vitamin?
no, I mean the only thing I have to say in regards to the vitamin A benefits would be anecdotes that I personally have, and you don't want to hear those,
No,
right? Okay.
like at the very, very bare minimum, I'd want to see case reports, but you know, preferably things like randomized trials. Okay, so did you want to discuss saturated fat and cholesterol and its relationship with heart disease? Because I have seen a few videos on your channel where you were claiming saturated fat and cholesterol do not cause heart disease.
I mean, we could. I mean, the problem I have is there hasn't. We're debating back and forth on all these different things, but when we actually go to look at the physical studies, they're done on people on standard American diets and pretty
No, not
much.
all of them. Well, you actually believe that saturated fat and cholesterol do not cause heart disease, correct?
I mean, like,
Or are
can you
you neutral?
like? Do you mean if I eat saturated fat and cholesterol in human amounts for the next 80 years, do I think I'm going to drop dead of a heart attack? Is that the question, kind of?
Well, no, I'm saying, do you believe that saturated fat and cholesterol have nothing to do with heart disease risk?
No, I mean, there's obvious associations that have been proven with that, but those, um, then you have to kind of just go into that inflammation, insulin resistance, and all of those things that
Well,
cause the inflammation of the body.
saturated fat is pro-inflammatory and it does cause insulin resistance.
And then
Heme iron, which you
and
intake a lot.
using saturated
Go
fat
on.
as a blanket term for monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, all the
Those aren't
different.
saturated fats.
Uh, no, but
Mono and
like
polyunsaturated fats
when
are
you look
saturated
at
fats.
any food that contains saturated fat, it also it's not just going to be, at least for the most part, foods that people are eating, just saturated fat. And you have to look at the context of what other fats and oils they're eating in their diet that cause inflammation. It's not, as much as you're saying saturated fat as a blanket term, no one only eats saturated fat. That's not how it works. Even saturated fat
No, no.
in animal foods has monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated. It has a bunch of fat and vitamins and things. You can't just use a blanket term to describe a substance like saturated fat. It doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, saturated fats do activate certain pro-inflammatory genes. They do alter the gut bacteria to be pro-inflammatory, and you can even see an immune response from saturated fat. So during consumption of saturated fat, you see greater monocyte adhesion, which is the immune cells in your body. But when you consume omega-3s, you don't see that immune response. So saturated fats definitely are pro-inflammatory. And they also break down into non-esterified fatty acids, which are toxic to insulin-producing beta cells in your pancreas, which causes diabetes. So
You're taking one aspect of a food out of the context of all the other beneficial things that like monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat,
well, we're
various
not talking
vitamins.
about mono and polyunsaturated fats. We're talking about saturated fat.
Yeah, but my point is that you can't talk about saturated fat without mentioning those other things. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, no, you can, and we can talk about those other things and how they modulate heart disease risk, but saturated fats are in fact pro-inflammatory. They activate immune responses, like they increase monocyte adhesion, and they produce toxic breakdown products which kill insulin-producing beta cells in your pancreas, which, especially among genetically predisposed individuals, it'll result in type 2 diabetes.
But this is like what they did with the hydrocarbons in the rats, where they took like 10,000 times the amount. They isolated a substance that occurs in a natural food.
No,
You
no,
know,
no. I'm talking about humans.
yeah. But
This is all research in humans.
if you're consuming, what I wanted to get at was if you're consuming saturated fat from healthy food sources that I would consider healthy, like
Like what?
wild game, wild caught fish, things like that. It's present with a lot of other vitamins, beneficial fats. That's the
Okay,
reason you eat those foods.
well, Frank, let's talk about some of these confounding factors here. So, are you telling me that if you eat saturated fat from wild caught game like a deer, that fat is not going to break down into toxic breakdown products known as non-esterified free fatty acids and kill insulin-producing beta cells in your pancreas? How is that saturated fat any different than saturated fat in a piece of beef?
Well, that's actually a tough question to answer because I think deer fat would actually be only mono and polyunsaturated fat.
No, it would have saturated fat. It's a leaner type of meat. It would have
Um,
less of it than like, grain-fed beef cattle, but it's going to have saturated fat in it.
so the basis of you just isolating? I mean, this isn't really something I honestly, because for me the whole saturated fat, cholesterol, blah blah blah, all that arguing stuff has been done 100 times.
Okay,
Like,
well, Frank, do you like I just want to know, do you actually believe that saturated fat and cholesterol do not contribute to heart disease risk?
if you're talking about heart disease risk in the context of studies, I already answered your question. There are plenty of
Well,
studies that
dude,
show. There are plenty of
no,
studies that
it's a yes or
show.
no question. It's a yes or no question. Do you believe saturated fat and cholesterol increases risk of heart disease?
I can say yes in the context of studies. People that have higher saturated fat and cholesterol intake in certain studies have been shown to have higher risk of heart disease. But as I said, all of these things that I'm talking about, saturated fat in the context of what food you're eating, other factors in the person's diet, what other foods they're eating, you can't just isolate. I could probably isolate some obscure consumption. What could I say? Maybe I could say, I don't know. What's a good example? Maybe I
Okay.
find a group of people that really like eating popcorn, and I start showing that, okay, popcorn increases risk. People that consume popcorn have a higher risk for heart disease. But you have to consider other lifestyle factors, other things they're eating, other things they're doing in their life that are associated with people that tend to consume higher amounts of saturated fat, especially in the context that, the majority of people are like, if you walked up to someone on the street, they would probably agree that fat is not, they would probably think that fat is not good for you. You have to take those other things into consideration as opposed to just isolating a specific thing.
Okay, Frank, you're talking about confounding factors, and that is a reasonable concern when you're doing epidemiological research, but there's enough mechanistic data proving that saturated fat does increase risk of heart disease due to increasing serum cholesterol levels. And you yourself, you picked out the Maasai of Africa as people following an ideal sort of diet, they have extraordinarily high prevalence of heart disease. You've even admitted this yourself and linked me research showing that. So, like, I don't even know what you're really trying to argue here. Like, does saturated fat increase heart disease risk or not? You didn't really answer my question.
The saturated fat increase heart disease risk. I mean, in the context of the studies you're talking about, that's not, as I
No,
said, like I'm
like
not.
there's enough mechanistic data. Saturated fat does in fact raise serum cholesterol, and serum cholesterol is the main risk factor for heart disease. Do you believe
Okay, so
that to be
I
true or
mean,
not?
I mean, the problem is there are studies that show saturated fat. There's, as I said, there's studies on both sides of the table. There's studies that show saturated fat has no link between very LDL, and there's studies that show it does. There's studies that show dietary cholesterol increases. There's studies on both sides of the coin. So I don't
Well,
really
not
want
all.
to beat this
Okay.
to death because this
Okay.
could be
So
another.
this is important because you don't seem to be able to understand what research is credible or not. So the studies showing that there's no link between saturated fat and cholesterol intake and heart disease risk. They're typically prospective epidemiological studies where they don't take baseline cholesterol into account. So there's two issues. Like if you have a baseline cholesterol intake of 0, any added dietary cholesterol will have a very significant impact on your serum cholesterol score. So say if you're vegan and you decide to eat an egg every day, your cholesterol will increase by roughly 10 to 15%. But if you're eating like a standard American diet where you're consuming roughly 400, 500 milligrams of cholesterol per day, if you add an egg to your diet, there will be little to no change in your cholesterol score. So your body has
The whole reason
regulatory. Well,
I
listen,
really just
I'm
don't
not
like
done.
talking about this
I'm not
whole.
done. I'm not done. Listen. So your body has a regulatory mechanism with cholesterol, and a lot of the research showing that, oh well, higher intakes of cholesterol don't associate with higher incidence of disease. It's just because they're not taking baseline cholesterol intake into account. If you compare a cohort of vegans to meat eaters, the vegans obviously will have lower rates of heart disease because they have lower intakes of saturated fat, they eat no cholesterol, and thus their serum cholesterol score is much lower. And that's why in the Adventist cohorts, vegans had a 55% reduced risk of ischemic heart disease. So you're just referencing bad data here.
Uh, I don't think I referenced anything.
Well,
My whole
I've
thing
seen
with the
videos. Well,
my whole
listen.
problem with this whole cholesterol versus saturated fat thing is you're coming into this discussion with the acceptance that saturated fat and cholesterol are bad for you when
Yeah.
that original hypothesis traces back to them injecting rabbits with whatever they gave saturated fat to rabbits that have that is an obvious reason you shouldn't be giving saturated fat to rabbits. It's not they don't eat
Okay,
saturated fat in their diet. The
Frank,
whole
there's been
premise
more
of
research on heart disease than animal experiments conducted 100 years ago on rabbits. You understand that, right?
But my point is that the whole premise of everything you're talking about right now is based on conventional wisdom,
No, it's
everything that
not. No, it's not.
people
It's based
accept
on
for
metabolic ward
granted.
experiments. No, it's based on metabolic ward experiments and
That we're
actual.
trying to prove that saturated fat and cholesterol. This is not a discussion I'm having in a short span of time without looking at data and research. I'm not doing this without, like, I have some stuff in front of me. I have some things in front of me, but I'm not. This has been beaten to death. And whether you're a vegan or a carnivore, you're going to look at the research that fits your whatever you want to believe in, and you're going to try to discredit the other person's research and say what they're doing is wrong. I don't
Well,
think the
Frank.
saturated fat and cholesterol thing needs to be beaten to death anymore.
Well, Frank, that's complete nonsense. Look, I've seen a few of your videos, and I saw a video you made specifically about saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. You referenced articles made by Chris Kresser. I don't know why you'd reference articles made by just a random person who just has a degree in acupuncture and Chinese medicine. The research you're looking at is flawed by design. They're pretty much all prospective studies where they didn't take baseline cholesterol intake into account. There's enough individual variation in baseline cholesterol itself. So if two people were eating the exact same diet, they'd have different cholesterol scores. And if you don't take baseline cholesterol into account, then you're going to end up with a data set that doesn't show any association between something like saturated fat and heart disease, because saturated fat intake doesn't usually correlate with serum cholesterol, just because of the wide difference of individual variation in serum cholesterol. So again, if you look at things like randomized trials, dietary change experiments, metabolic ward experiments, reducing saturated fat and cholesterol is associated with lower serum cholesterol, and typically you see a reduction in heart disease risk. And again, that's why
as I said, I don't want to beat this to death. There are studies that show that having high cholesterol is associated with lower mortality, and there are studies showing that low cholesterol.
No, there isn't. No, there isn't. No, there aren't. What they show is reverse causation. If you take it, it's especially prevalent with elderly populations. But when elderly people get sick, so let's say they get cancer, they get the flu, their just general health is declining, typically that lowers their cholesterol, either from a direct result of the disease, medications they're taking, or from confounding factors like you're not feeling well, you're not going to eat as much, your cholesterol goes down. And just them being sick lowers their cholesterol. So it's not the low cholesterol causing disease, it's the disease causing low cholesterol. So again, this is just reverse causation.
I should have asked this sooner. The point. What is just the overall premise? Like that saturated fat in the diet increases cholesterol
both saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet increases serum cholesterol, and serum cholesterol is the principal risk factor in heart disease.
Okay, but if we say we can't really say that when lipid panel gets much more complex than that, and honestly, above my pay grade.
It really doesn't.
We know that HDL to LDL particle count, C-reactive protein, lipoprotein. We know all of those things are much more significant in indicating inflammation.
No, Frank, I've heard this argument before. You've probably listened to Peter Attia a little too much. He used to be a doctor. What Peter Attia does is he cherry picks research on overweight people with diabetes. And what they found is with overweight people with diabetes, different biomarkers are a little more accurate for determining heart disease risk, like LDLP, C-reactive protein, ApoB. In the general population, LDL-C is the most significant risk factor for heart disease. With diabetics, the biomarkers are a bit different because it creates a different lipid profile. But among the general population, LDL-C is the most important risk factor for heart disease.
That's what I'm saying. LDL. That's why you can't just say cholesterol as a blanket term. Doesn't make sense.
Frank, among the general population, LDL-C is the most important risk factor for heart disease. Now, among overweight diabetics, it changes a bit, but still, that doesn't change the fact that LDL-C is harmful.
This is, as I said, has been argued back and forth. There's probably 100 people you can have on here that can discuss cholesterol and argue cholesterol. And I don't know how many times
they don't know what they're talking about.
But you're disagreeing with anything that goes. You will disagree with any. And what I just said, you agreed with, is that there's other factors outside of just total cholesterol that affect your cardiovascular risk. That's not. This is much more complicated than what you're saying.
Well, no, Frank. I'm not like trying to reduce this down to be as simple as possible. The biggest risk factor among the general population is LDL-C. That doesn't mean things like LDLP, ApoB, C-reactive protein don't play a role, but LDL-C is the most significant. And among diabetics, things change a bit. Other biomarkers are a little more relevant, but that doesn't mean LDL-C doesn't still play a risk factor here.
Well, if you want to discuss this, let's just look at cholesterol in general and the function that actually causes heart disease is primarily because of inflammation and oxidized fats. Correct?
Okay, well, dietary cholesterol increases the susceptibility of serum cholesterol to oxidation, and a lot of the foods you're eating, like foods that are high in saturated fat, high in heme iron, like red meat, they're pro-oxidants. So they increase. So you're eating foods that increase LDL to increase the susceptibility of LDL to oxidation, and you're eating foods that cause oxidation.
So, any food, an oxidized fat, a rancid fat, an inflammatory fat is not an animal fat. That is not what we're talking about. I don't
No,
understand.
Frank, you're not understanding me. Eating dietary cholesterol increases your serum cholesterol, increases the susceptibility to oxidative modification. Also, the foods you're eating that include heme iron, like red meat and steak, heme iron is a pro-oxidant. So again, you're increasing the susceptibility of your LDL to oxidation, and you're eating pro-oxidant foods. So you are not only increasing your serum cholesterol, but you're also increasing the amount of oxidized LDL particles in your circulation.
No, but when you're not consuming oxidized fats or inflammatory foods in general, that does not matter.
Okay, so how is heme iron not inflammatory?
Heme iron is inflammatory in the context that most people consume it in because it's absent of other vitamins and things that are required to metabolize it. Let me just go look at I did a video on this like 2 weeks ago.
Frank, how does heme iron become non-inflammatory and not a pro-oxidant?
It doesn't, but the rate you consume it at and the foods you consume it with affect its digestibility, how it's absorbed in the body. You need multiple vitamins and other minerals to absorb iron in the body.
Well, no, not for heme iron. It bypasses your regulatory mechanisms. Normal iron from plant foods, that is true, but heme iron just bypasses your regulatory mechanisms. And again, heme iron is a pro-oxidant. So you're talking about like oxidized LDL particles as being harmful because they're pro-inflammatory. Well, you're eating foods that increase the susceptibility of LDL to oxidation, and you're eating pro-oxidants that actually oxidize your LDL
You see, the
particles.
problem is with what you did with the saturated fat. You're isolating a food outside of the context that it would normally be consumed in.
Okay, Frank, tell me, well, like, how does eating something that's grass-fed or free range or whatever, how does that change the fact that heme iron is a pro-oxidant?
Let me just look at my studies that I have from my video list because this was not an easy explanation after doing it a few hours of research, let alone off the top of my head.
So, Frank, heme iron itself is very closely linked with heart disease, diabetes, and certain forms of cancer. There's a meta-analysis titled, "Is Heme Iron Intake Associated with Risk of Coronary Heart Disease? A Meta-Analysis of Prospective Studies." What they found was per milligram intake of heme iron per day, it was associated with almost a 30% increase in heart disease risk. I think they ended up with 1 milligram per day was associated with a 27% increased risk of heart disease. So 1 milligram. How many milligrams of heme iron are you intaking per day?
One second. As I said earlier, I'm not comfortable discussing these things or with you having, because I have studies that I looked up about all of these things from heme iron to cholesterol to whatever it is, but if I'm not making statements on heme iron or saturated fat or any of these things without having the data off
Okay,
the top
well,
of my head.
you knew you were going to get into a debate today, so why wouldn't you have prepared some research surrounding the relevant topics?
I did, but you don't seem to take my answers of you isolating these things outside of the context of how they should be consumed as
Okay,
a reasonable discussion.
well, Frank, how does heme iron not become a pro-oxidant when the animal eats grass?
Because it's not about heme iron itself. It's about the context of the person's diet and if they have the
You're
required vitamins and minerals to metabolize iron properly. So it
Frank,
does not
you're
stay in the digestive tract.
Frank, you're talking about confounding factors. Heme iron is a pro-oxidant, no matter what you consume it with, if you consume it with anti-inflammatory foods, yes, it offsets the anti-inflammatory pro-oxidant properties of heme iron, but heme iron is still a pro-oxidant, so why would you consume it at all? What's the
But this,
benefit?
what is so important about this one? Don't vegans usually have higher blood levels of
No,
iron in general?
no, I don't believe so. They don't have a higher prevalence of iron deficiency. And like Frank, what's the benefit of consuming heme iron when it's a pro-oxidant and it's linked with heart disease, diabetes, and certain forms of cancer?
Because you don't seem to understand that my point is you need to consume these foods in the context of overall nutrient density. And if you isolate any compounds in a food, you can make an argument for why it would be bad for your health.
No, not really. Again, Frank, like nothing you're saying here is at all consistent or makes sense. Like first you were claiming that like hunter-gatherer populations they don't have chronic disease, and then you link me the Maasai, who you claim have an ideal diet, extraordinarily high rates of heart disease. It's just that their rates of mortality from heart disease are low compared to standard Americans. Um, so like again, why would you consume heme iron? I just don't understand. Like you can consume lentils, you can eat high vitamin C fruits and vegetables that aid with iron absorption, and then you'll get enough iron. You don't get any of the pro-oxidant effects, and things like lentils, beans, peas, they're associated with longer life expectancy. So why would you eat like a carnivore diet or eat like the Maasai when, there's a better way of doing things?
If you want an answer on this heme iron thing specifically, give me 2 minutes, or well, maybe a little more than
Okay,
two
sure.
minutes. So what the base is that heme iron is oxidizing, whereas non-heme iron isn't? Is
Well,
that the main concern about, or is it also about the concern about just the heme iron association with various
well,
diseases?
heme iron is a pro-oxidant, and it's associated with increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, and certain forms of cancer, whereas non-heme isn't. Thank you.
What is your what is your which part of the, are you just talking about like the interaction of heme iron in the large intestine with other?
Well, no, I wasn't even talking about like
Oh, you're
I
just
wasn't
talking
even
about why
talking
it's
about
inflammatory.
digestion.
You're talking about why it's inflammatory, right?
Yeah, it's a pro-oxidant.
Yeah, but that oxidation occurs in, and that inflammation occurs in the large intestine,
Okay.
and that's because of its interaction. And this is the study I did on my video a couple weeks ago. It's because of its interaction with N-nitroso compounds and like cured meats and stuff. It's not necessarily to do with heme iron in itself. It's
Heme
about
iron produces the endogenous production of N-nitroso compounds.
when interacting with. Let me look at the study to read the exact context.
Well, Frank, this isn't exactly relevant to what I'm saying. Heme iron
It is
is
because
a,
you're just isolating a food and saying it causes oxidation, when the reason it's causing oxidation is because it's an absence of other vitamins and minerals, and because it's interacting with specific negative things
what
that are in these
vitamins and
unnatural
minerals?
foods. If you look up iron metabolism,
Well, what vitamins and minerals? Like what food that contains heme iron is not going to have these pro-oxidant effects?
what do you mean? Like what food? Like does the food have? What's the question? Like what vitamins do you need to
But
absorb iron, or what?
no, like I'm asking, like you're claiming that, oh, well, the only reason they find an association between heme iron intake and risk of heart disease is because they're not consuming it with some other vitamins or minerals, or it's not the right type of grass-fed whatever. What food that contains heme iron doesn't have these pro-oxidant effects?
Oh, I mean, like cured meat, sausages, and just in general, the way we're raising our animals now, especially like chicken and pork and stuff, it just has incredibly high levels of, well, not necessarily incredibly high, but it has normal levels of heme iron, but it doesn't have any of the other vitamins or minerals or anything present necessarily to metabolize the iron.
Okay, well, no, this occurs with fresh meat.
But
So,
fresh meat does not have, if you, all you consume is fresh meat, it doesn't have vitamin A, it doesn't have large amounts of the other minerals like copper and zinc and things that you need in balance with iron, to at least enough amounts of these other vitamins to, the animal has to be consumed in the context of like nose to tail eating, in order to, like I think something like blood sausage, or just pretty much what you said earlier, the skeletal muscle. Just consuming large amounts of skeletal muscle, to
okay,
my understanding, especially in the context of a standard American diet, would just cause unnatural amounts of heme iron to be in the blood, as opposed to uh, having the adequate other things that would normally be consumed with that much heme iron.
okay, Frank, it sounds like you're doing this thing where you move the goalposts further and further back. I have this sort of issue all the time with people who promote keto or carnivore or whatever. When I link data showing, okay, well, intake of this nutrient is associated with increased disease, well, they say, oh, well, it's not grass-fed, free-range, organic, whatever meat there that you're supposed to be consuming. Well, Frank, the fact is, there's mechanistic data proving that heme iron is a pro-oxidant. It causes the production of N-nitroso compounds endogenously within the body, and according to epidemiological research, it's very strongly linked with heart disease, diabetes, cancer. Like, you can make these claims all you want. Well, heme iron isn't as bad when you're eating it with organs and the animal's free range, grass fed, and it's wild or something. Well, that literally doesn't matter. Heme iron isn't good for you, period. You're just adding in a list of confounding factors that may modulate its risk, but heme iron is still bad for you. Like, why would you consume any amount of heme iron?
I don't think I answered anything yet. I'm still trying to look through my studies for the specific reference I have. So the point that, and you're talking about N-nitroso compounds, but those N-nitroso compounds that you're referring to have nothing to do with heme iron. They have to do with the oxidation of heme iron. What my point was earlier was that these people are consuming these cured and processed meats that have nitrates, and they're using a direct fire drying process, which forms those compounds. And then heme iron interacts with these compounds that are a result of the nitrates in the food that cause high levels of inflammation. And that's the main reason, that there's a very high colorectal cancer risk with heme iron and nitrate cured foods.
Okay. I'm still not hearing a reason why heme iron in particular is totally safe to eat.
I mean, you
Like,
don't,
again,
you don't have the reason that heme iron would be bad for you is because of its interaction with those cured meats and those compounds in those cured meats. That's the reason it could be bad for you. There's
um,
no, and
I'd imagine it's worse because of those factors you mentioned, but heme iron itself is a pro-oxidant. So, like, again, you're just adding on confounding factors. Like, okay, yeah, if it's cured, if it's like treated at high heat, it makes it worse. But I'm not hearing an argument for why
what
heme
is
iron
your,
is perfectly
what
safe.
are you saying? Like, heme iron is a pro-oxidant, but you're just saying that it's associated with inflammation because of other things. It is not specifically an
No, it is.
oxidant.
No, it is. Again, like, even with the supplement form, it's associated with increased risk of heart disease, and for the same reason.
Because you're consuming it outside of the context of the amount you're supposed to consume it in, and you're having
How much?
the
Okay, how
interaction you're
much?
referencing, with oxidizing iron is because of those problems with the nitrates and the curing process of foods. It has nothing to do with iron in itself.
Okay, so you're saying heme iron is not a pro-oxidant when you're eating fresh forms of meat.
But you no, I'm saying that I'm saying that heme iron is detrimental in the context of N-nitroso compounds in cured meats. And
So, right. So you're saying it doesn't act as a pro-oxidant when it's consumed in fresh meats.
but what is it doing in the human body that's you would consider damaging in the context of just iron
Well,
itself? It
it's
doesn't do,
oxidizing LDL particles. and oxidized LDL particles are more atherogenic. That's why there's a strong
But
association with heart disease.
iron doesn't cause that has nothing to do with the oxidation of LDL particles. That has nothing to do with it.
What are you talking about?
Dude, you could literally oxidation of LDL, they're results of not having normal metabolism, diseases, toxins, any things like that. If you're saying that iron, when consumed in excess, specifically causes
No,
this.
not in excess. Per milligram intake of heme iron, it's associated with about a 27% increased risk of heart disease. So that's not in excess. That just means replacing uh, like normal plant sources of iron with heme iron.
You're changing this from initially you were saying heme iron causes whatever your definition of
I said it's a
oxidation,
pro-oxidant.
it's not that.
So it causes the oxidation of LDL particles in your serum, in your blood, and
That has
oxidized LDL
iron has
is more.
nothing to do with that. Iron has nothing to do with that.
Okay,
That's
so
inflammation
how?
caused by free
So
radicals and things like that. That has nothing to do with iron.
um, I don't even understand what you're arguing at this point.
My understanding of heme iron going into this was that you were going to reference the N-nitroso compounds and go into that. And that's because that is the only thing, to my knowledge, that heme iron is associated negatively with. Anything else you're saying, I have literally never heard of or have never done any research on. I don't know why you're dwelling on
Okay.
this point. Because there's nothing that you can, I don't know
Well,
what you're referencing that you could show me that iron does these things, but I've been
okay.
looking up everything you've been saying for the past 10 minutes, and I really got nothing, to be honest, outside of the initial heme iron versus nitroso compound stuff.
Okay, well, the research I just linked to you, the meta-analysis, is heme iron intake associated with risk of coronary heart disease, a meta-analysis of prospective studies. Heme iron may contribute to the development of atherosclerosis by catalyzing the production of hydroxyl-free radicals and promoting low-density lipoprotein oxidation. So again, heme iron itself is a pro-oxidant, and it oxidizes LDL in the serum, and that's why it increases heart disease risk. It's also associated with increased risk of diabetes and cancer for a very
What did
similar
you
reason.
just read? Are you reading the
I
results?
think that was the last study I linked, and it was just the first part of the abstract. So, like Frank, according to the data I've seen, heme iron.
Hold on. Can I just reread this, please?
Yeah,
Heme iron can contribute to the development of atherosclerosis by catalyzing production of hydroxyl-free radicals and promoting low-density lipoprotein oxidation. So, catalyzing production of hydroxyl-free radicals is what you're saying it's doing. Not you're saying it's by doing that it's promoting oxidation, right?
sorry.
You're saying what you're saying is not that heme iron. You're saying heme iron promotes oxidation because it catalyzes production of hydroxyl-free radicals. That's what
Yeah.
this study says.
Okay.
So give me like 2 minutes because I'm not a biochemist. You don't have the full study here, do you? Because that would help.
No, it's the full text isn't available. Okay, well, Frank, anyways,
All right. Well, either way, the problem with this study is the uh, relative risk factor is 1.27. So you might as well just throw this study out the window, man.
a
Like this doesn't matter.
30% increased
One
risk
point.
per
If a
milligram.
study, if a study has any, if a study's like, it needs to be at least over 2. Like most people would just throw
No,
this
it
out, man.
doesn't.
Yes, it does. This is
No,
like
I don't think you
this is
understand what a
insignificant.
hazard ratio is.
This is insignificant in the context. This is like
No, it's
anyone who
not.
understands relative risk would just dismiss this study. I'm not talking.
So
I wish you linked this earlier because I wouldn't
a
have been.
30% increased risk per milligram of heme iron intake is insignificant.
This is yeah, it is insignificant in the context
Okay,
of
so
research.
if I consumed 3 milligrams of heme iron, that would increase my risk by like a hazard ratio of 2.0. So like 100% essentially. Double the risk.
I just wish you know even if I did want to entertain the idea that this dog shit study was admissible with this risk factor, I just don't have the full text and I'm trying to find it.
Okay, Frank, anyways, according to the research I've seen, heme iron is a pro-oxidant
But
and it is associated with increased risk of
no,
chronic
but you're
disease.
just see the thing is you're just
You're
linking
now listen,
studies
now
and you're
listen,
not
listen.
showing metabolic process, you're not
Now,
showing.
okay, that's fine. But I'd like to see some conflicting information from you because so far all you've said is like grass-fed, though, essentially.
No, I haven't said anything actually. All I said was that heme iron in the context of N-nitroso compounds is probably the highest
Okay,
known
I
negative thing associated with heme iron.
I can agree that processed meat is worse than, fresh meat, but I'd like to see actual data suggesting that heme iron from fresh meat isn't harmful. And you can link me laboratory data, mechanistic data, population data. I don't care. I'd just like to see conflicting information here.
So what I'm thinking right now is the information you're presenting in regards to the dangers of heme iron. You haven't not proven to me that heme iron is damaging outside of the N-nitroso. You can't, outside of the interactions with the nitrates, there's nothing to me that indicates heme iron is detrimental. So with a basis of we don't really know, you just want me to try to prove that it's beneficial.
Well, Frank, according to the data that I've presented to you, heme iron intake increases risk of atherosclerosis. And it does
That
that.
data, that study is complete dog shit. And if you want to dwell on that, I will try to find the full study.
Okay, it's not just a study, it's a meta-analysis. So it's not exactly just bullshit.
The risk ratio for this is too low. It's way too
How,
low.
so per milligram, so if the study did per 3 milligrams of heme iron intake, it increased the risk of a heart disease by 100%. That would, I'm not getting this. It's like you don't understand that this is per milligram of heme iron. So if you consumed 3 milligrams of heme iron, according to the study, you'd double your risk of heart disease. And this is a meta-analysis, by the way. It's not just a single study.
You see, every study you've linked me today, unfortunately, does not have any text. And there's no
Yes,
base.
unfortunately, the full text isn't
There's
available.
no basis because my problem is there's no basis for this besides this study, and you can't physically explain to me
It's
what
not just a
this.
study; it's a
You're
meta-analysis.
both of us are unable to explain what heme iron physically does in the body outside of my explanation for its interaction with N-nitroso compounds.
Okay, well, Frank, despite that, the epidemiological research clearly shows heme iron intake increases risk of heart disease. Now, you can say the only reason for that is because of consumption of processed meats, but I'd like to see data on that. If we're only looking at fresh meat consumption, is there no association? I'd even like to see some laboratory data showing, okay, well, it doesn't produce like these N-nitroso compounds, hydroxyl free radicals, and it's not a risk, like it doesn't cause the oxidation of LDL particles. You're not showing that, but the research clearly shows there is an association between heme iron intake and heart disease risk.
And you're not talking specifically about like you're not talking about people that like are not consuming meat and they have low iron levels. Is that relevant? Like deficiencies of
Well,
iron?
this didn't have anything to do with deficiencies. It just had to do with percentage of consumption of heme iron. There's also two other systematic reviews and meta-analyses I have on hand. Iron and Cancer Risk, a systematic review and meta-analysis of the epidemiological evidence. And again, in the abstract, it says iron has been suggested as a risk factor for different types of cancers, mainly due to its pro-oxidant activity, which can lead to oxidative DNA damage. So heme iron is well known as a pro-oxidant. Now, I'm not an expert on.
Because this is the problem. You can't, And
Now, I'm not look, I admit I'm not an expert on
we can't
why
talk. This
it's a
is like a lot of
pro-oxidant.
these points you're bringing up and we're talking about. We are simply not educated enough to speculate on this. That is simply it.
Well,
Like,
we are.
no, we
Again,
could speculate, but
we
there's you
like.
can't say these things you're saying like definitely as you are.
Well,
It
look,
doesn't make any sense.
Frank, the results are like according to these meta-analyses, these large compilations of research, heme iron is a pro-oxidant, and because of its pro-oxidant activity, it's
Dude,
associated with a
I
significantly
told you
increased
what
risk of
my opinion
disease.
on this study is, and the relative risk is too low in the context of what
The
people would
relative
consider
risk isn't
admissible.
too low.
Yes, it is
No,
for
it's
any
not.
study. Yes, if it's not like if you're talking like 1.9, 2.5, then maybe we could look into it, but this is not anywhere close.
Frank, that's per milligram of heme iron intake. So, according to this meta-analysis, if you consume 3 milligrams of heme iron, you'd have about a double increased risk of heart disease. So, like, why is that hard for you to understand? Per milligram. That doesn't mean if you consume any heme iron at all, like you have a 27% increased risk. No, it's per milligram. And again, there are other systematic reviews and meta-analyses linking the pro-oxidant effects of heme iron to cancer and also diabetes. I'll link you another meta-analysis and review. Dietary iron intake, body iron stores, and the risk of type 2 diabetes.
This is
Systematic
not
meta-analysis. So
all this
look,
says is
the vast majority of research, Frank, shows that heme iron intake is damaging to human health.
dude, this fucking I'm not talking on this point anymore. This study you linked me is dog shit. Furthermore, we conducted meta-analysis for colorectal relative. Is this even this is so are you linking me different ones now? Am I looking at a
No,
different
I
one?
just linked you the one I mentioned.
Well, you got 3 different ones. You got hold on. Are those are you did 3 different studies, right? That's it?
Yeah, one on heart, like a meta-analysis on heart disease, meta-analysis on diabetes, meta-analysis on cancer. The last one's the diabetes one. And it looks like the diabetes one has the full text available.
The
And
heme iron intake with risk of coronary heart disease meta-analysis that you've been talking about for the
okay,
past 20
so
minutes is
the two. So sorry, just a second. The two meta-analysis I linked on cancer and diabetes, the full texts are available. So if you want to read later after the debate, you can.
just this first study you linked with the relative risk is from 1.04 to 1.67. So some found no association.
Okay.
And the
So,
dose
that's why
response
there's
of
a
relative risk of
meta-analysis.
CHD for an increase of heme iron intake of 1 milligram a day was 1.27. That's not saying that that does not mean that 1 milligram per, it's not per 1 milligram. It means that these people increase their heme iron intake of 1 milligram per day, and this was their risk. This does not
Yeah.
mean if you make it to 2, it's going to be, it's not going to, it's not multiplicative. That doesn't, what you're saying is disingenuous, and you're interpreting the data in your favor.
Oh, I think
And
I
even,
understand what you're
and
saying.
even if
Heme
you,
iron intake of 1 milli. The dose response risk ratio for coronary heart disease for an increase in heme iron intake of 1 milligram per day. I think I understand what you're saying. I misinterpreted it a bit. But anyway, if you add 1 milligram to
that's
your
not, no, but that's not
daily
what the
diet,
study says. You're
if
just
you
putting,
add 1 milligram, so the relative risk, if you add 1 milligram of heme iron per day to your daily diet, you increase your risk of heart disease by nearly 30%.
or one
It's not
or
insignificant.
0, because there were some people in that study that
No, not
had no,
0. It says no, the lowest was 1.1.
1.04 was the lowest, which is insignificant. That is not admissible data.
Well, no, dose response risk ratio, heme iron intake of 1 milligram per day was 1.27, and it went from 1.1 to 1.47.
Okay, I'm going to be a little more serious. I'm not entertaining that dog shit study anymore. I'm going to look at the second
Okay,
one,
great.
iron and cancer risk, a systematic review and meta-analysis of the epidemiological evidence. You said this one has the full text, but the third one only is the one I saw with the full text.
They both have a full text. They have a full text link on the top right-hand corner. Anyway, the vast majority of data shows that heme iron intake is associated with an increased risk of
So
chronic
this
disease.
the other study, iron and cancer risk, a systematic review of meta-analysis of the epidemiological evidence, blah blah blah, dietary iron. Furthermore, we conducted meta-analysis for colorectal cancer risk. confidence interval 1.00 to 1.17, colon 1.12, 1.03 to 1.22, breast 1.03, and then 0.97 to 1.09. They actually found an inverse risk with breast cancer in some cases. And lung cancer, they found relative risk was 1.12 and the range was 0.98 to 1.29. So they found inverse risks on the majority of these studies, which means this is really dog shit. Do you understand what relative risk is?
Averages.
You understand what averages has nothing to do with what they, and if you have
on an individual level, yeah, you can see variations where you find an inverse relationship, but on like the entire scale of the study, they found more often than not it increased risk.
Any of these studies you're linking me, if you do a study and you find one person that contradicts the whole study, that's it. It's inadmissible evidence. This relative risk is dog shit, and I'm not. This study is out too. We're moving on to the next study.
Frank, that's
dietary
not how
iron intake
works.
That is exactly how it works. And if you ask
Frank, if you find one person who smoked their entire life, they never got cancer, that means smoking doesn't cause cancer?
No, but for something like smoking, the relative risk is exponentially higher. Let's look at the relative risk for smoking.
Yeah, sure, but like the claim you're making is if you find one outlier in a data point, that makes the entire set of data worthless. So if you find
it doesn't, because the relative risk for smoking is like, it's not 1.1, it's like fucking 70.
Okay, so then rare outliers in a data set don't impact the credibility.
These are not rare outliers. Research. The large majority of this data is either there's this data. For anyone with half of a brain that looks at this data would say this is inadmissible because they didn't really show anything.
Well, no, they actually did find.
I'm going to move on to the third study. I'm not entertaining these two other studies. I'm going to move on to the third one, and we'll take a look. Dietary iron intake, body iron stores, and the risk of type 2 diabetes: a systematic review and meta-analysis. Results: excess iron has been shown to induce diabetes in animal models. However, the results from human epidemiological studies linking body iron stores and iron intake to the risk of type 2 diabetes are conflicting. In the study, we aim to systematically evaluate the available evidence. So they're just trying to show some association with type 2 diabetes, even though the past research has not shown anything.
Well, no, the past research on diabetes didn't show anything because they didn't actually take into account heme iron, just total.
I'm just reading what this.
Isn't that what it said?
I didn't read maybe it said that next. I'm not looking at the full text. I'm just looking at the abstract right now. Analysis of 5 studies gives us 1.19. Individuals will have level of heme iron intake. Is this the same one that you link? Is this the same one that you link me? Is this one of the studies that meta-analysis analyzed earlier? Is this?
No, this is a systematic review and meta-analysis for risk of type 2 diabetes and dietary iron intake and body iron stores. Look, the pooled risk ratios for type 2 diabetes mellitus in individuals with the highest versus the lowest intake of ferritin levels was 1.7. That's pretty damn significant.
I didn't read this yet. Dietary total iron, non-heme iron, or supplemental iron intakes were not significantly associated with type 2, but why are you linking me in the study, man?
What?
The conclusion:
higher heme iron intake, body iron stores were significantly associated with greater risk of type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, but dietary total iron, non-heme iron, or supplemental iron had nothing to do with it.
Someone sent me the link. I sent it to you on Facebook.
Okay.
We have the entire study.
This study says that their tissue levels of iron had a higher risk, but that had nothing to do with their dietary iron. This study is irrelevant.
Well, no, it also looked at dietary iron intake.
It did, but it said that dietary iron,
higher heme iron intake and increased body iron stores were significantly associated with a greater risk.
Hold on, let me wipe my eyes. Maybe I'm reading this wrong. Dietary total iron, non-heme iron, or supplemental iron intakes were not significantly associated with type 2. Maybe my
exactly.
Not associated with type 2.
I told you about this before because it doesn't take into account heme iron. This is total iron.
No, you said no. Listen. Hold on, stop.
Why are you
You
cherry
said
picking
before.
one
I'm
sentence
not
out of
cherry picking shit. I'm reading the studies. You fucking linked me, and you didn't even read them yourself.
Okay,
What you
Frank,
said.
Frank,
Listen. I'm gonna take my headset off. Let me say this. What you said when I was reading the background was that it said like, however, the results from human epidemiological studies linking body iron stores and iron intake are conflicting. That and then you said those previous studies that they did not account whatever, but they did in this study. And now you're saying they didn't
Yeah, they
account for
did,
it?
and they found an association between heme iron intake, body iron stores, and type 2 diabetes.
No,
They just
no, no.
mentioned, no, listen, Frank, they mentioned in the conclusion that total dietary iron is not associated with risk of type 2 diabetes because your iron, like most people's iron, primarily comes from plant-based sources. And they found that non-heme iron wasn't associated with type 2 diabetes, so iron from lentils isn't associated with type 2 diabetes because it's non-heme, and supplemental iron is
Dude,
also
you're honestly, man, anyone that interprets this data, you're picking the wrong arguments to make. I could have myself, I could have
Frank,
made a better argument for.
Frank, you're cherry picking one sentence out
I'm
of the
not,
meta-analysis, and
no,
you're not
but if your point is that your point earlier that you wanted me to discuss was that consuming dietary or any heme iron in general causes diabetes, and now you're saying it's tissue levels that are a problem. That doesn't make any sense. I'm gonna if I was in your position right now arguing against me for heme iron, I could have fucking crushed me because I know that heme iron can be shown in a very negative light in other aspects. What you're trying to show me right now is the last fucking thing you should be trying to show me, because these studies, the relative risk is inverse in some cases, and it doesn't, and even the conclusions of these studies doesn't make sense. I think for your credibility, you should move away from heme iron in regards to diabetes and oxidation and all of these things that are very apparent, even with the studies you're linking me, that there's nothing to do with them. Let's move on to something else.
Frank, okay, I just want to be clear in this meta-analysis I linked for everybody who's interested. Dietary iron intake, body iron stores, and the risk of type 2 diabetes, systematic meta-analysis and review. The authors found that the intake of heme iron and increased body iron stores were significantly associated with greater risk of type 2 diabetes.
That's not what we're discussing.
However, what they found was total iron wasn't associated with risk of type 2 diabetes because that would include non-heme iron. Non-heme iron wasn't associated with type 2 diabetes risk, and supplemental iron was not associated with type 2 diabetes risk. So, yeah, again, like heme iron intake is associated with risk of type 2 diabetes, and it's also associated with risk of certain cancers.
All that study says is having higher tissue levels of iron. It has nothing to do with, the study specifically states that you linked that dietary iron has nothing to do with type 2 diabetes. That's exactly what the study says. It literally says we found no associations with any sort of dietary iron intake, whether supplements, heme iron, or non-heme iron. That's exactly what the study says. It has nothing to do.
A meta-analysis of 5 studies gave a pooled risk ratio for type 2 diabetes mellitus of 1.33 in individuals with the highest level intake of heme iron.
Are you talking about the third study right now?
The diabetes meta-analysis. It clearly says the pooled risk ratio for type 2 diabetes among the people with the highest intake of heme iron was 1.33.
Which one are you reading right now? Dietary iron intake, body iron stores, and risk of type 2 diabetes, a systematic review and meta-analysis? This is the one that specifically says dietary total iron, non-heme iron, or supplemental iron intakes were not significantly associated with type 2 diabetes. Why the fuck do you keep hitting this, man? This means that dietary iron intake has nothing to do with it.
Frank, there's a difference between total iron intake and heme iron intake. Most people get their iron, like the majority of it, from plant sources. So when you do total iron, 90% of that is probably plant iron, and the rest is heme iron. So it's not surprising they wouldn't find a big risk with total iron intake. They also didn't find an association with non-heme iron intake, so iron from lentils and supplemental iron in type 2 diabetes. But they did find an association between heme iron intake.
This is just one of the studies that they did a meta-analysis on earlier. It had the same low relative risk ratios for iron.
That's not a relatively low risk ratio.
If I take
increasing diabetes risk by 30%,
1.09 to 1.23.
1.19 to 1.48 was the risk ratio, and the average was 1.33.
That's pulling together.
Yeah,
that's not pulling together just iron intake. That's pulling together.
That's heme iron.
That's pulling together. What is it pulling together?
Look, I'll read the
It's
sentence
pulling
for
together
you.
1 milligram of heme iron. It's pulling together ferritin receptors, pooled RRs, lowest intake of ferritin. Then they adjusted for inflammatory markers as well. So this is not just heme iron, man. If you're talking about heme iron and risk for this study, it's 1.09 to 1.23, which in any
No, Frank, you're misreading things. So in this meta-analysis, the pooled risk ratio for type 2 diabetes in individuals with the highest levels of heme iron intake was 1.33, and they did another risk ratio for a daily increment of 1 milligram of heme iron, which was a risk ratio of 1.16.
Dude, honestly,
Those are two
like,
different things.
like this has been like, honestly, like at least 2 hours out of this to me has just been completely unproductive and bullshit and going back and forth on a study that
Okay,
isn't really admissible for evidence.
Frank, I just want to know why you think it's a good idea to intake any amount of heme iron when the vast majority of research shows it's harmful to human health.
First of all, your research does not show that at all. And I will,
Okay,
and you can
sure.
let the chat interpret.
People can read these studies, and when the authors say there was a significant increase in risk of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer from intake of heme iron, like I'm sure they'll interpret it that, yeah, they didn't find any association between heme iron intake and risk of disease.
Well, no, they will. When people read the studies and then they look at the relative risk and then they look at the methods they use and the actual data they use for these studies, they probably laugh in your face. But to answer the question of should we be taking heme iron, I said this earlier. It's in the context of the whole food in itself. It's not, you're not physically taking heme iron and ingesting it. You're ingesting it in the context of either of an inflammatory food, such as whether it's bacon or sausage or some processed meat, or you're consuming it in its natural context. And then if you wanted to discuss, okay, what are the negative things of consuming those foods and those foods, that's a discussion you can have. If you're trying to isolate this compound and use these studies with these super low relative risk ratios, it does not make any sense.
Okay, well, Frank, do you have any evidence that consuming heme iron from ideal sources is not linked with any type of disease?
You
And do you have
can't.
laboratory data or like any kind of mechanistic data that would suggest that?
This is not, the burden of proof of me is not necessarily to
Okay,
prove
so
that
you don't
consuming.
have any evidence for these claims. Okay,
No,
so we can move on.
the evidence behind the claim is if you're consuming foods in order to get adequate nutrient density in the diet, that heme iron is present in those foods invariably.
Okay, Frank, I asked you if you have any evidence that heme iron from ideal sources, whatever those might be, do you have any evidence that heme iron from these ideal sources does not increase risk of chronic disease, either from population-based data or from laboratory data?
Do you mean like a positive association with higher heme iron levels, or just the foods that contain heme iron?
No, just like the foods that contain heme iron. Say if you're eating grass-fed beef liver or something like that, or whatever you'd consider ideal heme iron intake, whatever that is. Do you have any data, whether it's population-based or just like laboratory experimental data? Do you have any like data showing that heme iron intake from these ideal sources is not associated or could not increase disease risk?
You just mean like anything in regards to consumption of pretty much any animal product that contains heme iron that shows
No,
lower
I'm
risk, or
talking about what you consider an ideal source.
oh, like man, is that, well, what would I look for?
Because, like, Frank, vegans don't have a higher risk of, like, iron deficiency than meat eaters. So what would be the point of
I mean,
consuming heme iron?
what do you want me to, like, do you want me to show like
Well, you're claiming that
like consuming fish is associated with higher levels of like,
no, Frank, you're claiming that the research I linked was using less than ideal sources of heme iron for the basis for their research. Do you
the
have
only thing I'm saying about your research is the relative risk is too low to get any conclusive data. That's all I'm saying.
okay, so like a
Further into it,
30% increased risk is insignificant to you.
no, the point is not that it's the first of all, that's not the average in all of those studies. Second of all, it varies. Even in that study, with you're saying 30%, it was like from 1.04 to 1.67. And anyone who looks at relative risk ratios and data understands that that is not admissible as correct data. I'm not explaining this again. I've explained this 5 times. So what do you want me to show you that
Right.
consuming
So
a food that has heme iron in it can be beneficial for your health?
yeah, well, no. Like I'm asking you, do you have any data showing that heme iron from ideal sources doesn't have this pro-oxidant effect or doesn't increase risk of chronic disease like heart disease, diabetes, cancer?
Maybe this is something. Hold on.
And what would be the point of consuming heme iron in the first place?
It's not necessarily the point of, as I said, it's not necessarily the point of consuming heme iron. The point is to consume high vitamin foods that just inherently have heme iron.
Okay, well, vegans don't have an increased risk of iron deficiency, vitamin A deficiency, vitamin K deficiency, so I'm not really understanding the argument here.
Let me just read something here real quick. Intakes of smoking essence a bit because smoking women current smoking women higher intakes of Okay, so this study, I mean, listen, man, honestly, I don't really have good studies that I would really like to be using for this, or things that I think are great illustrations of my point, but it's definitely something we can discuss on. So this study that I just found, this talks about dietary intake of iron, heme iron, magnesium, and pancreatic cancer risk in European prospective investigation, the cancer nutrition cohort. And if we look at the results, intakes of total iron and heme iron were highest in Spain, Greece, and France, although for heme iron, dietary intakes were even higher in Sweden and lowest in the United Kingdom. The relative distribution across the countries is comparable. And then we look at the data, magnesium intake, iron intake, heme iron, the median. So if we look at the heme iron intake in, let's say, what's the high one? What's the highest one here? If we look at the heme iron median, let me just link the image address of the chart. I'm not sure if you're looking at the same one as me. So that's the image address of the chart. And I have not looked at this before. I'm going through it right now. Just keep that in mind. If we look at the heme iron intake in Denmark, it's 1.9, and the age years median is 56, and that's the highest one. If we look at low heme iron, which is the UK, 0.5, then the age median is 52. So they're actually 3 years lower life expectancy. But then if we look at just the iron intake in general between the UK and Denmark, it was slightly lower in the UK. And the magnesium intake is only slightly lower too. So they literally consume 4 times the amount of heme iron in Denmark, and they have a 3-year age median that's higher. But is the age median, what does that indicate? That's just...
Well, Frank, none of this is really what I was asking for. You're trying to claim that the research I referenced, they were focusing on non-ideal sources of iron, and on top of that, the risk ratios weren't significant enough.
No, they're not. That's the only basis for your studies. The risk ratios are not significant enough.
So why is a risk ratio of 1.27 not significant?
Because it's not 1.27, it's 1.0 whatever to 1.6 whatever. That's why it's not significant. If they find outliers, and this
Frank,
is, if
Frank,
you look at
you're
risk
not going-
ratios for things that are commonly accepted, it's way different. Like, let me go look at the
Like what?
risk of let me go look at the risk of colorectal cancer and heme iron real quick. Give me like 2 minutes.
Well, Frank, give me an example of something that has an adequate like risk ratio where you could associate it with disease, like any food.
What do you mean? Like, you want me to find a food that has a high risk ratio with disease?
Yeah, like what's a food that you would consider has an adequate risk ratio for a particular disease?
It should be what I'm about to look at right now, the processed meats. If what I remember is correct in this study.
Because by your standard, I literally think there's absolutely no food that you can say increases risk of disease if you need a risk ratio of like 2.
Where is the relative risk? Where is the summary? Might not be the right one.
So what are you trying to find?
I'm just looking up the risk for colorectal cancer and processed meat.
Okay, I don't think you'll find a risk ratio of 2.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the data I had. There was something I wanted to just look over. So you wanted to also see something that just showed that consuming meat has inverse associations with just colorectal cancer. Would that be adequate for the?
Well, an association. Or sorry, you're saying processed meat?
No, this is just regular meat, like pork or lamb has both an inverse and positive association with colorectal cancer. It shows both on drastically different ends.
So I'm not understanding what you're saying.
It's just pretty much showing that they looked at like a regular meat product that maybe I would consider healthy, such as just a steak or something, and they showed that it has like a 0.5 to 1.5 risk ratio, which means that whole meat in general has no risk associated with colorectal cancer. And the reason that's relevant is because colorectal cancer is probably but colorectal cancer is directly associated with heme, iron, and nitrate composition of the food. But
okay.
if we have, I see another study right now, case control studies published between 2003 and 2007 on the relationship between processed meat intake and colorectal cancer risk. In China, the preserved meats have a 1.5 to 2.9 and a 1.9 to 3.8. So odd ratio is 2.7 and 2 in China for that study.
Okay.
So there are definitely, that's an example of the colorectal cancer risk being pretty significant. It's almost 3. And then there are. If I knew you were gonna.
Okay. Well, what about heart disease?
And what, the heme iron?
Like anything.
Just
Like
heart
if you're
disease
going
in
to
general.
say a risk ratio of like 1.27 isn't significant, then is there any food
So
or
I'm sorry,
anything
man.
that you can?
Just real quick. You edit
Well,
the silence, or is it
sorry,
just do you edit the silence, or this is all just live?
this is
Like
all
when you
live.
publish it? Okay, so I did want to apologize for not getting all this research in front of me and making this go back and forth a lot. So did we want to just kind of summarize like our thoughts
Well,
on iron and heme iron?
well, yeah, sure. I mean, the majority of the data just shows that heme iron intake is harmful to human health. You can find some research that doesn't find an association, but overall, and I think especially for heart disease and diabetes, there is a pretty strong association.
So I guess let's just kind of so basically the heme iron thing in regards to the oxidation and the cholesterol and all of that stuff, we don't have enough information behind the metabolic processes to really discuss that in depth. In regards to heme iron and nitroso compounds, we can safely say that certain processed meat products are literally poison in regards to colorectal cancer. In
Sure.
regards to the actual studies you linked in regards to the heme iron associations, the relative risk is too low to say anything. And in regards to the studies that I just looked at now, there's us, and this confirms the processed meat, especially like the Chinese processed meat that they were consuming, should not be consumed by anyone, and that the risk for actual meat and like whole cuts of beef is actually inversely associated. They found positive associations with colorectal cancer and consuming just regular fresh meat. So there's definitely
How strong
a
was the
lot of
inverse
conflicting.
association?
It was literally 0.5. It was literally like, and then let me, like, I'm looking. I'm looking at the sheet
Okay,
right
well,
now.
Frank, another thing to consider is heart disease prevalence is so incredibly high to begin with that you also have to consider when you see a risk ratio of 1.27 or something, that's probably more significant than it sounds.
You mean because in the context of their overall health?
Yeah, I mean, in the general population, heart disease risk is so high to begin with. Like an increased risk ratio of 1.27 is more significant than it sounds.
I mean, especially if you consider, hey, maybe just this one substance is 1.27. But then if you take 30 other goddamn things and they're all 1.27, that's where we have an issue. No, there's definitely a lot of truth and merit to that. But do we want to just start talking about do we want to keep talking about specific things like heart disease in relation to meat, or do we just want to talk about how overall most people that consume animal
Well,
products are just consuming them in the context of such unhealthy diets?
okay, well, you know what? I think we should kind of wrap up the health topic, and I'd like to discuss the ethics here. If you want to have like any kind of final statements about these things, that'd be fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to apologize again for me not having a lot of things together. I've been going on some job interviews lately. I haven't had really any time to sleep, let alone put a lot of effort into this. And I do appreciate you taking the time to discuss these topics with me, despite my, having to kind of fumble and get the studies and talk about things. But, specifically all these points, I think there's about half the cases, there's definitely associations in the context of standard American diets and most people right now where there are definitely detrimental health effects to consuming a lot of these substances that are in meat. And on the other hand, there's a lot of studies that don't show association, and we have to understand that the context that they are being consumed in is more important, as well as other factors like lifestyle and other things can kind of just really set the precedent for. And I guess the vitamin thing, the plant versus animal vitamins is especially a topic that needs to be researched more, and just especially us without the context of biochemistry and the lack of understanding of all of these things to go in depth and really dispute these things, especially with just the few studies we have and what they're relevant to, is it's very difficult to really say anything definitive with the exception of a few things.
Okay, so my final statement about the health topic is I think there's an adequate amount of research showing that animal products do increase chronic disease risk in humans. And if we look at studies like the Adventist cohorts, it's pretty clear that lifelong vegans can be perfectly healthy, live very long, healthy lives free of chronic disease. Again, vegans in the Adventist cohorts, lowest rates of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, hypertension, lowest rates of obesity. And in the Adventist cohorts, they were the second longest living. They were beaten out by an average of 2 to 3 years by fish eaters. But nonetheless, you can live a very long, healthy life as a vegan, and for that reason, I think it's unethical to kill animals, exploit them, through agriculture, and that'll be the segue into the ethics topic.
Can I touch slightly on you saying the long, healthy, happy vegan thing?
Sure.
The Adventist. So in what's interesting is I believe it was a Georgian or Siberian group of people, and they had a very, very high infant mortality rate. It was something like 25 or 30, like 25 to 35%, I believe. And after infant mortality, their life expectancy was like over 90. It was crazy. And their diet for what?
Which group of people?
I think it was Georgians. I don't want to say specifically, but let me finish the story before.
Georgians?
Yeah. So, but the point is
People
that
in Florida?
no, like the Georgian country in.
Okay, I haven't heard of this. Sorry.
No, Georgians are Kartvelians, a nation and Caucasian ethnic group native to Georgia. Let me just look exactly where on the map it is.
Okay, so you're saying if you account for child mortality, they had a very high average
No, let me
life
finish the story because
expectancy.
this is actually in agreement with you on the plant-based diet. So these people had a high infant mortality rate, but once they got past that infant mortality rate, they lived very old, and their diets were actually
average life expectancy after.
I mean, let me if I could try to find I tried to Google this earlier.
Because right now, as far as I know,
No, it's not
Adventist
that. It's
vegetarians
definitely not
have.
that. It was, but these people. No, my point is these people. I think their diet was like 80 to 90, 80, almost 80, at least 80, maybe yeah, at least 80% plant-based. So they
Okay.
had a lot of heirloom grains. They had a lot of, they made their own vodka. They made their own, they made their whatever, just like living off the land, so to speak, but very heavily plant-based off of grains, prepared in traditional ways, soak the grains, reduce the anti-nutrient content, especially that's the only grain they're eating. And they lived very long and happy lives. But one thing to keep in mind is, and all of these other civilizations that live really long, I've noticed they're very, very active. Like these people would literally hike for 10, 12 hours a day. There's definitely some factors in that. But so to summarize that, to my understanding, you can live a very long and healthy life on a plant-based diet, but these people had, 10, 20% of their intake was from those high vitamin animal foods. And can we replicate that with modern supplements? Possibly. So it's definitely interesting that it seems that you can live a long and happy life as a vegan outside of the context of that infant mortality. Because the reason those people had a high infant mortality rate is because they did not have the nutrition that they needed in regards to certain vitamins and fats during the developmental stages of the children.
Okay, do you know what in particular?
No, but if you can imagine, if the only food they have to eat is grain for a period of months, and they don't have any meat or fat, they just don't have a source of fat soluble vitamins at all. I mean, it's pretty
Okay,
much,
well,
they
it
didn't
could
have.
just as well be something like B12 or iodine.
Yeah, but in the context of their diet, it was just so low. Like, right, vegans now, they get so much more B12, iron, and fat soluble vitamins, especially like people eat a lot of avocados. And like, you have to understand, these people did not have access to plant-based fats. They didn't have access to that. So it's definitely interesting to see if we could replace the animal fats with modern methods of plant fats. But that was just something I wanted to throw in there. Some interesting
Okay,
anecdotes.
so you do believe you can live like a long, healthy life as a vegan?
Well, yeah, you can, but it's also interesting. You know how like us Italians are pretty short, and how people in certain areas of the world have various statures depending on their past diets and history. I think that has a lot to do with, Italians are. It's speculative that the reason Italians are shorter is because they had a higher amount of grain in their diet and lack of maybe not as many vitamins as someone in a different part of the world would have during their developmental stages. So there's something to be spoken about the necessity of having a certain amount of vitamins during growth, and if that can be obtained on a plant-based diet. That's the only questionable thing
Okay,
that I had
well,
of it.
right, well, but during infancy, like, your main fat source is going to be breast milk.
The only question in that is if, like during the pregnancy period and the gestation period, if the mother had adequate vitamins in her diet. Most of the time for the
Well, that
first.
can affect it, sure.
Yeah, no, that was just something to bring up. I mean, we don't have to dwell too much on that.
Okay, but otherwise, you do believe that people can live like long, healthy lives in a vegan diet?
Yeah, outside of that initial developmental
Okay.
context and with modern intervention,
So
it might be possible.
so why do you think it's morally acceptable to like kill and eat animals?
Should I say that like I have actually slaughtered animals myself? Is that important in this argument? Like I'm willing to do it
Sure,
because I know some people have a problem with people that just go to the supermarket and buy meat
you
off the
can bring that
shelf.
up. Sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I know a lot of people like I really do. Listen, if it was up to me and I could just let the animal live and live off of its milk and eggs and things like that, I would do it because I really do appreciate life in general, whether it's a plant or an animal. I really do appreciate life, and I understand, in the context of my health, when I'm taking the life of an animal, it is an inherently cruel thing that I think has just been done for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, and it's just part of kind of almost human nature at this point, as just predators and hunters, that it's something we've done and kind of accepted. But uh, the question about is it acceptable, and to get on the topic of morals, I guess a point I could just say is I respect animals. I make sure that the animals I purchase and the food that I purchase lived a happy and healthy life, and that the slaughter process was as humane and caused as little pain to the animal as possible.
Okay, so like I think we can understand that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong, but
Mhm.
why do you draw the distinction at suffering and not include killing So like, why are you fine with killing, but you're not okay with
The only
suffering?
reason I'm okay with what's it called when you have cognition and you're like aware of yourself as an animal and you ever
Self-aware.
yeah like just
Well,
like
yeah,
yeah like you know how
self-awareness.
like some children can be feral sometimes like that are left abandoned. I don't know if necessarily children, but a better example would be like feral cats and how they're living off of their instincts. And I think us humans at a time just lived off of our instincts, so to speak, and having this cognition and ability to understand that killing an animal might not be what we would want to happen to ourselves is might not be good, but it's just been part of us and part of nature. And it's weird because our instincts and what we've been doing for years and years and years have been hunt, kill the animal. This is how we need to live and how we need to survive.
How do you know
But
that's an instinct?
I mean, because, primitive humans, before we really had cognition and before we really had, um, and even if you look at, there's a great book called The Hunting Apes, where monkeys and chimpanzees they would hunt and get meat and very, very brutal stories, to be honest. But
Well, sure. This can all be a part of culture. How do you know that's an instinct?
well, I mean, my point was that it used to be an instinct and now it's become part of culture and just things that we've done.
Right. So how does that justify killing?
You mean in a sense of like getting nutrition for ourselves and surviving ourselves?
Well,
Is that
like,
like the reason?
you've already agreed at this point that you can be healthy on a vegan diet or at the very least a plant-based diet. Like, let's say, okay, eat, like for the sake of argument, I don't actually believe this myself, but you could at least be vegetarian and, maybe eat some eggs and dairy here and there and still be in good health. So why wouldn't you like at least reduce the amount of animal products you're consuming just to not kill as many sentient beings?
Are you talking about like me personally?
Yeah. Yeah, you personally.
I try to. I mean, I consume less than 1,500 calories a day. I eat literally minimally as possible. I've always tried to use milk and dairy products, but I'm very, very allergic. I'm actually trying them again this week. Probably a bad idea. But in all of my attempts to do this, it's pretty much the only reason I haven't been able to reduce my food intake. And I believe that, from everything to just consuming less calories to saving money to being less wasteful to having to kill fewer animals, that it's an important thing to do. And I've actively tried to do that. But with my severe food allergies and intolerances and ability to just feel good and energized on certain foods, I've just used that as the justification for me to feel healthy and be a productive human being.
So,
Um,
Frank, have you ever gotten a test for Candida or SIBO, like bacterial infection in the small intestine? Or
I've gotten, I didn't have any of them. I mean, the doctor just
you've
pretty much
actually gotten
said,
the test?
I had
Were they
tests on
non-lethal
the,
tests?
I didn't have tests on the, I didn't have tests on the Candida came back just like didn't matter at all. The SIBO,
Well,
no,
did it come
but
back positive or not?
no, negative. But this dude, you have to keep in mind, like I've been on a carnivore diet for 6 years, but I had that test like 3 years ago. Like there's no way like I would have had Candida 3 years ago after being on a carnivore diet for 3 years.
Well,
Uh,
no, you can. That's not going to just cure Candida.
no, I didn't have it to answer that question. But what is that? What is that's just the relevance to my health in
Well,
general and my gut
well,
health?
you're talking about food intolerances. A
Mm.
lot of the time, people who think they have like a food intolerance or an allergy, it's actually caused by Candida, like a fungal infection,
No, I mean
parasites, or a
I've had
bacterial
allergy
infection.
testing. I've seen
Well, it's different than an allergy test.
what's
So,
the doctor gastroenterologist? What's it called? What's
yeah.
the stomach doctor? Yeah,
Um,
I've seen a lot of them as well in New York City. Um,
Well, you want to make sure that you don't have bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine, and you also want to make sure that you don't have any parasites, candida, or fungal infection, because all of those things can make you sensitive to certain foods because they prevent you from breaking down things like oxalates, salicylates, histamines that are common in plant foods that normally wouldn't be a problem because your body can easily break down and
I mean,
digest
I
them.
do have a pretty severe histamine intolerance in general.
Okay.
I mean,
Um,
that's one thing worth
so
mentioning about my allergies.
So have you ever actually gotten a test like these tests done to confirm that you don't have any parasites, bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine, and candida fungal infection?
I mean, I had stool samples taken and had it tested in December of last year
Do you know
for everything.
specifically what for, though?
They did they did bacteria, they did the parasites, and then but the candida was before that. The candida was like a year or two before that. But I definitely don't have any fungal bacteria infections or
Okay,
parasites.
I just because these are confirmed with both stool and urine tests. I like if
No,
I were you,
I
I'd
literally
make.
had a stool test like 9 months
But
ago now.
do you know what they were actually testing for?
Yeah, that it was literally because I ate like 5 pounds of Alaskan salmon that had worms in it. So I got the test for the parasites. And then they also
Okay,
tested the
but
full bacteria. They did a full bacteria panel on the stool, whatever that was. And
okay,
no, yeah.
I'm not sure if that actually tests for bacterial overgrowth in the
You
small
mean like
intestine.
fungus? No, for
Well,
small intestine.
bacterial
No,
overgrowth in the
I
small
did not
intestine.
get the only test to clarify. The candida test was like 3 years ago.
Okay,
The stool sample test, which was in December of 2017, was all the bacteria and the parasites.
okay. This still isn't very clear. It like I'm not sure if you actually got the test done for bacterial overgrowth. So that might be something you want to look into. And there's also two tests involving that, like a urine and stool test.
I had
So
no, I
you
mean,
might want to look into that again.
I don't know specifically if they tested for that, but it was both a urine and a stool test, and I did it twice, like 10 weeks apart. But the all of these hypothetical things, what is your like solution to these
Well,
problems? Is it
I'm
an
well.
elimination diet? Is it medication? Is it certain antihistamine drugs?
Well, it depends. Like if you have bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine, you'd want to take antibiotics. If it's like a fungal infection, you'd want to take antifungal. If it's parasitic, antiparasitic medication. I'm just thinking that these food intolerances you have, it's likely due to some sort of like intestinal problem you have that might be able to be fixed with medication.
I mean, you have to understand, I've had these food allergies and problems my whole life,
Yeah.
even before this diet. And, uh, but dude, I have literally fasted for 3 weeks on just water. So
Well,
I
that's
don't,
not really going to do anything
yeah, I just
if you
wanted to
have these
bring that up and
problems.
hypothetical if that would actually affect how much that would affect, that bacteria, if it would,
No, it
possibly.
wouldn't really. A lot of people think it would, but it doesn't. You'd need antibiotics to like get
Mhm.
rid of like bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine and other things like that if it's a parasite. It might be worth looking into because it sounds like you'd actually prefer to eat a plant-based diet, wouldn't you?
Uh,
Like for ethical reasons, at least.
um, you know, I'd have to like I've tried in the past incorporating more plant-based foods and I just haven't been able to. Uh, for
Like what foods in particular have you tried introducing?
like naturally fermented einkorn bread, various heirloom grains, naturally fermented, sweet potatoes, blueberries, macadamia nuts, uh,
You
seaweed. Just
even have problems with blueberries?
yeah, um,
Like what happens when you eat blueberries?
they come out as blueberries.
Oh, really? That's weird.
And this wasn't like one time, man. I had blueberries for about a month straight, and they were still doing that. So,
Okay.
yeah, like
Um,
a big problem that I believe is, you got to think of like I just have that intolerance to foods that are old, like like what was the blueberry picked 2 months ago, frozen, thrown in a bag, and then I get it 2 months later, like
well, most people don't have these sorts of problems, so it sounds like there's some sort of issue with your digestion that could possibly be fixed.
no, I mean, I agree completely that a lot of people would probably be able, and as I spoke about earlier, all these indigenous groups consumed 50 to 60% of their calories from, well, not, maybe like 55 to 65% of their calories from animal foods, and then the remainder from plant foods. And there were
Kind of
varying,
depends. It depends on the tribe you're talking about, and
yeah,
it
that's what
also
yeah, yeah,
depends on
for
the
sure.
season.
Yeah,
Like
that's
the
exactly.
Maasai, like huge source of calories for them was honey,
Yeah.
and they
That's
also eat blueberries and shit.
Yeah, I am not against incorporating plant-based foods into your diet for both nutrient density and just, out of enjoyment as well as just energy. I'm not against that. It's just the problem for me is the plant foods that I have access to and the ones I have purchased are either exponentially more expensive than meat or I just can't tolerate them. Those are my personal issues with it.
Okay, so for everyone else, like the general population, would you say they should follow a plant-based diet for at least ethical reasons?
I mean, the Swiss in the Locental Valley, which is in Weston Price's book, all they ate for all they really ate was cheese, dairy, and rye bread, and they were perfectly healthy. So in the context of that diet, I mean that's perfectly possible if your gut can tolerate those foods. Does that answer that
Well,
question?
no, I'm not saying that. Like, I mean, an actual vegan diet. Would you recommend people eat a vegan diet for ethical reasons?
For ethical, well, if we want to talk about ethical reasons, then we got to start talking about, where were your plant foods from and how does that affect things? That's like if
Okay,
we're talking
well,
about like, are we talking about strictly ethically like the treatment of animals? Because we know with a lot of modern farming methods, like habitats are displaced, herbicides and pesticides,
that's
there's a
going to
lot of
happen regardless.
like that's going to happen regardless. And we know that there's inherently some, but the question I guess that I would like to bring up is, would you rather, for me, the way I look at it is, participate in local agriculture, make sure, the animal that you buy or purchase or the dairy you get is from an animal that has lived a healthy life. And then the plant foods that you buy are local and not produced in that, conventional monocropping or whatever. That to me is ideal, whether the food is animal or plant-based, that you're supporting kind of almost local or smaller agriculture. But then when you get into the debate of, you know, should someone, for me, if you start going to the supermarket and buying stuff, I'm like, well, compared to what I just mentioned, that's already a negative, isn't it? Because, you're with the previous thing, you could be, ethical and beneficial for the environment. But now when you start buying stuff in the supermarket and questioning where foods are from and how the meat was treated or where the grain, or maybe, if that grain was, who knows what, like that becomes questionable. For me, I guess to answer your question, me personally supporting local agriculture, I'm not worried about those factors of, things that are going to happen anyway, like a fawn getting ground up in a harvesting machine, or like mice getting displaced and then hawks eating them because I'm not thinking about those things because I don't purchase food from those types of systems.
Well, you're going to displace natural native wildlife if you support any form of agriculture.
I mean, in the
And
context
like,
of like,
and especially if you're talking about grass-fed animals, like the amount of land use is massively increased. So you're actually
well,
going to end up displacing
in the
more animals.
United States, we don't necessarily displace other animals for pasture, but in other countries that is a big
Well,
problem.
you do. Well, you do. Like small rodents are displaced by uh, like grass-fed, pasture-raised cattle.
I mean, yeah, but what's the difference between like, I mean, yeah, we're doing it ourselves inherently, but isn't that more of like like let's say like a group of, I don't know, some bison roamed across the plains and found themselves in a new area. There's a difference between
Well, no,
this.
they'd get preyed upon because they're not in their, they're not in their native environment that
Yeah, no,
they'd normally be in to avoid
I
predators.
agree with that, but
Like the
the
thing too is, Frank, regardless of the method of agriculture, more animals die in the animal agriculture industry than in plant agriculture.
um that I mean that's the question that I would ask is, what's worse? What's worse? Killing one cow to feed yourself for a year, or how many animal, like what, then you have to place a value on sentient beings. That's like
Well,
it.
one cow wouldn't feed you for an entire year.
I mean, on a zero carb carnivore diet, it could.
No, I don't think so.
Uh,
Like, and again, per
well,
unit of land, there's a much greater yield for
I mean, it
calories.
only takes, it's depending on the quality of pasture, between 1 to 2 acres per cattle grazing. But the hanging
One to
weight
two acres.
for like in the context of the whole farm, it's usually 1 to it depends. It could be as low as 1, it could be as high as 3 acres depending on the pasture and the irrigation for the cattle.
Okay, I think you're way underestimating that. That
No,
sounds
that's
very
not
low.
for one animal. One animal, that is it. And that's, you keep in mind, they graze the pasture, they and then a few weeks later they're back to that same plot of land. That's with proper pastoral management. But that's not what I wanted to focus on. The hanging, I mean, I used to work in steakhouses and stuff, so I'm familiar with the hanging weight of all these animals. And the modern grain-fed steer that people buy in when they're buying their Costco ribeyes, I don't really want to talk about that. We could talk about more, because those animals will be up to 2,000 pound live weight. If we're talking about an average grass-fed animal, usually depending on the age, they can get up to like, and the breed, and whether it's various factors, they can get up to like, I guess the high end would be not the high end, but a generous average would be 800 pounds live weight for a grass-fed animal, which would yield about what is it? Maybe like 600 hanging weight, and then you have the organs that are not included that you can eat as well. So, 600, 500, 600 pounds of meat and organs for a year. Maybe a couple things thrown in there, but that's sustainable as a person's main caloric source for a year.
Okay, well, Frank, this also isn't about one cow. Like, again, you are going to displace natural native wildlife in whatever amount of land you're using, even if it's just small rodents.
Yeah, but if you're
also,
the problem with that
like,
saying that is those
also,
rodents work with the ecosystem. That's just if you have an ideal pastured environment, the ecosystem, the cows graze, the chickens come and eat the flies on the cow poop.
well,
Like
the
you have a
cows aren't
system
native
that works.
species there. They're going to compete with natural native wildlife, and they're going to end up pushing out those rodents from that area of land because they're competing.
But then the question is that we can't really answer is what's worse, that
Well, we can.
or yeah, I
Well,
mean,
we
we can
can.
speculate,
Again,
is that worse
well,
than is that worse than you taking a monocrop and displacing, multiples more animals because of that? And
well,
and
again, like plant agriculture takes up less land, so yes, you'd end up displacing fewer animals.
but I mean, let's talk about like avocados and the probably slave-like conditions that people used to eat those foods. I mean, there's various problems with a lot of foods that plant-based
Okay,
dieters are emphasizing on, as opposed to going local
well,
and eating local grains and local stuff.
listen, Frank. Like, I mean, you've worked in a slaughterhouse before. I don't know if you've ever been on the kill floor, but I've
I've not,
actually talked.
I haven't worked in one, but I have been in one. Yes.
Okay, like I've talked to a lot of slaughterhouse workers, gotten into fights with them, and they're on edge like crazy because
Yeah.
they're doing horrible fucking work that they don't want to do.
Well, keep in mind,
It's
the
well, look, like
slaughterhouses you're talking about are not the slaughterhouses I'm talking about.
okay, well, no, all these animals go to the same slaughterhouses. The only exception is maybe fucking Mennonites and
I'm not talking about. Dude, I go to Muslim butchers for my meat. That's what I go to.
okay,
I don't
well,
go to commercial slaughterhouses.
there's a kosher and halal slaughterhouse in Toronto, and I see what they do. It's a video up on my channel. It's in Toronto, major city. They hang these animals up upside down, slash their throats open while they're fully conscious. By the time they start skinning them, some of them are still conscious, and they don't give a shit.
Okay,
So
you
look,
might not like me for saying this, but I did that myself on Monday. We took a little Billy boy, we hung him up on the hooks, and I slit his throat, and we let him bleed out.
what did you feel after doing that?
Uh, I felt like I was doing it better than going into the supermarket and buying my fucking meat. I
Well, did you
honestly
feel
was
bad?
I wasn't happy about it, to say the least.
Right.
I understand I had to take the life of the animal, and it was kind of
Well,
necessary for my survival. But it
well,
was
I
done
mean,
with respect and as clean as possible.
well, Frank, like I can understand that point of view, but I've been to these slaughterhouses where people do this shit all fucking day long. They're constantly on edge, and
I agree with
you
you.
know,
What those people do is not acceptable.
listen. Like they're constantly on edge, and they're very quickly to get into fights with you
Yeah,
because they're so pissed off from working in the shit all day.
yeah, from killing the animals.
And like, look, like the most recent statistic was like 97% of animals are like factory farmed.
Yeah, that's
So,
probably.
like, you're talking about the vast majority, nearly 100% of the industry works like this.
Mhm.
And you think that's like better than, okay, avocado farmers getting kind of cheated out of a decent deal for their crops? Like, okay, that's bad. But picking avocados, I don't think it's nearly as stressful as having to slit animals' throats open.
I mean, it's not necessarily about the physical act of picking avocados or what these slaughterhouse workers have to do. It's the whole picture.
Right.
It's like these grain-fed animals that they wean them off the mother too early. They put them on pasture for whatever period of time, then they feed them this crude soy, and then they go to the slaughterhouse. Like these animals have lived miserable, unhappy lives, and then they get slaughtered by miserable people that are working in these slaughterhouses.
Well, there's a reason this is going on in the first place. It's because it's way more efficient, takes up way less land, and it makes it cheap and affordable enough for people to eat, and
But
it supplies the demand.
you know, there have been a lot of people that are way more educated in regards to pastoral management and agriculture than me that, you know, it is possible to move towards more sustainable agriculture, but that's not what people
Sure.
want. People don't want to. People want to spend $1 a pound on chicken breast. They don't want to spend
Sure.
$3 a pound. People want to buy those Costco ribeyes for $11 a pound. They don't want to have to do what I do. They don't want to have to go down to the Muslim slaughterhouse, buy a whole animal. And I was boiling the vertebrae and I was eating foods I didn't necessarily want to eat out of
You bought a
necessity.
whole animal?
Yeah, it was the
What
whole
was
lamb.
it?
Whole lamb.
How much did it cost?
How much did it cost? I bought the live weight was 60 pounds. It costed $270, and that should feed me for about 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Okay,
Yeah.
I've bought, I think, a 30-pound bag of lentils from Costco. That lasts me for several months.
The
Like-
nutrition and there's a
Like,
lot
I'm
more.
I'm not saying lentils are 100% nutritionally complete, but you get a shit ton of nutrition. That's a staple of my diet, and that lasts for several months. And I really don't need to add too much.
If cost
extra.
is a comparison thing here, man, I'm not the guy to talk to. I literally used to go to
Right.
the farmer's market and I would spend $10 for a dozen turkey eggs. Like I would go buy, a gallon of raw goat milk is at least $15. So this food, in order to support these local farmers and buy quality food, you need to pay a decent price. I mean, yeah, I could drive out to Pennsylvania and get, if I want to drive a while, I could get good prices on this. But, supporting
Sure.
local farmers is, although in the context of how much money people spend on food in general, depending on your budget, it's not too much more. And a lot of people on the carnivore diet spend just as much as me. They just buy foods that they want to eat and foods that are way different than what I eat.
Right, but this just isn't practical for the vast majority of people, is what I'm getting at.
Well, I mean, that depends. That's right. How much effort do you want to put into caring about ethics and your lifestyle and the environment? How much effort do you want to put into it? Do you want to spend that $10 a pound for pastured chicken? Do you want to go down on your Saturday off? Or do you want to go to, do you want to go to Cipriani and drink mimosas? Or do you want to go down and I smelled like fucking shit, man. I smelled terrible all day. I was sweating my guts out, cutting this animal open, putting this stuff away. I was willing to do that. But most people, I agree, most people are not.
So, given that, wouldn't you recommend a vegan diet for the vast majority of people?
It's
Like, just
I guess
given,
I don't like
like-
answering. I don't like answering these questions. You ask me like yes or no, but what I can say about that is, oddly enough, most people that go on, not oddly enough, but most people that go on a vegan diet do get healthier because of how bad the standard American diet is. And I actually made a video that I think I deleted that said everyone should go vegan because it's better than what you're doing now. That's for sure. The only thing that might happen if you go vegan is you might get a B12 or iron deficiency, which happens. But in regards to being optimally healthy, I think we need to look at fat soluble vitamin and vitamin intake more. But for a lot of people, unfortunately, and I don't want to speculate on a percentage, but in the United States, possibly 60 to 70% of people, maybe even more, would see probably just it's overall healthier. And then there's maybe a select percentage of people that actually do eat fairly healthy and that get a decent amount of vitamins from certain foods that might see differences. But that's just speculation, man. That's not a definitive answer.
Okay, so you can agree that it's a good idea to reduce animal product consumption as much as you can, at the very least.
But what are you talking about? Are you talking about because like Americans get like 11 to 14% of their diet is protein. Like it's not high. So reducing their animal into, I think it's more about
animal products aren't just protein.
I think it's more about replacing shit in general with more whole foods. I think that's what I would agree on. Whether or not they're plant-based is up to you, but I think just replacing those foods you're eating with either high-quality plant-based foods or high-quality animal foods is what you should be doing.
Okay, well, Frank, like, let's say hypothetically, if you could be perfectly healthy on a vegan diet, you didn't have these digestive issues, would you do it?
You know what's funny? If you have, let's say someone develops perfectly and they had all the vitamins they need, and they're this like 6'2" Adonis guy, and then if you had proper development and got to that point in your life where mortality and development are not an issue, and then you went on a plant-based diet, Yeah, to me, my answer would be as long as I'm getting enough fat soluble vitamins in my diet through supplements or other means, or maybe like eggs and milk and I mean, not, I don't know if you're too, like, I don't know what your general consensus is on the vegetarian stuff, but yeah, I mean, that would be, to get, 20, 30% of my calories from high vitamin foods and then 70% plant-based. I wouldn't have a problem with that.
No, well, what about 100% vegan? If you didn't have these digestive issues and you could eat blueberries and whatever vegan foods and vitamins and supplements you needed to be healthy, would
My
you?
issue, my issue would be is, all right, let me answer. I can answer that with this statement. If in regards to metabolic processes in the body, the vitamins and the fats and the cholesterol and everything that's needed for optimal cell function and metabolic function, if my body was able to do that on this diet, I would do it. But those things, the supplementing, those vitamins and the bioavailability and all those things, to me, there just hasn't been enough research done on it. And I would honestly rather trust the natural foods in that context. Does that answer it?
Okay, well, given the fact that, like, according to the Adventist cohorts, like, vegans are very healthy, they're at least healthier than vegetarians and the general population, lowest rates of chronic disease, like, that isn't indication to you enough that, like, if you didn't have these digestive problems, you'd do fine on a vegan diet?
Well, no, because like I spoke about those Georgians earlier, they're pretty much are they, you know, are they the opposite of the Maasai in regards to plant versus animal-based diets? Yes, but they're both very active. They're both living their natural way. They both have very low stress lives. And to say that, I mean, I'm in agreement that a plant-based diet you can be healthy on. It's just, to me, the only thing that I think is questionable is just that base vitamin content. That's my only concern.
Well, Frank, the Maasai had very high rates of heart disease. Like, you even admitted this yourself. Like, the prevalence of the disease was very high. It's just the mortality of the disease was disproportionately low.
Yeah, but when I'm 90 years old and my aorta is like this big and I'm still alive, maybe there's a little
Well,
fat in it, but
you don't know what that's from, and these are like very small populations spread across a large area.
I know that was a
So
little bit of a
it
joke,
kind
but
of
my,
I
you
know what
know,
you mean,
yeah.
but it's just not very good information to go on when you have these small populations spread across a large area. They don't have a lifestyle, like they have a lifestyle very different from yours. It just doesn't really make sense to think, well, I can eat all these animal products and avoid death from heart disease because, like, some tribes people in Africa can get away with it.
For me, just my understanding of like the main culprits of pretty much disease in general, just being not eating whole foods is, to me, regardless of whether it's a plant-based diet or an animal-based diet, I'm comfortable with my health in either regard.
Oh, okay. But the problem is, these certain animal foods have been proven to increase disease risk. So, like, it would be ideal from a
I'm
health
sorry, not to
standpoint.
interrupt you, but do we want to go back into this, or what was like the
Not
original question?
really. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, we've kind of already covered health, but like, it's kind of hard to talk about this because your ethical standpoint kind of involves, your health beliefs as well.
Yeah.
Um, but like, just assuming like you didn't have these digestive problems and you could do at least as well as the vegans in the Adventist cohort, why wouldn't you go on a vegan diet?
No, I mean, if you're saying I would literally be just as healthy as I am now, that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, sure.
Then I'd be fine with it. But that is
Okay.
that has other problems that I have kind of gone over a couple times.
Okay, so you would agree then that most people should go vegan?
Dude, I just said this 10 minutes ago. Like,
Right,
most
yeah.
people in America would be healthier as vegans. Unfortunately, that's just how bad the standard American diet is.
Okay, well, is the vegan diet bad?
I mean, listen, I go to these like an interesting anecdote here is I go to these halal markets, these Muslim markets, and a lot of these people, I'm the only white guy there. But the reason I'm saying that is because all these people that come from these countries are still consuming their cultural and their indigenous beliefs. And they are, for the most part, very, from what I can see on the outside, physically healthy people. They're skinny, they're muscular, they have, it looks like they had ideal facial proportions throughout development in their life. And these people that are, why am I bringing this up? Because
Like, from what cultures are you talking about?
African culture is mostly
Okay, well,
Muslim, Middle Eastern culture.
They still have high rates of heart disease.
Depending on the location, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the Ugandans who have very low rates of disease, but they eat a corn-based diet.
It's again, it's hard to say. What was the original the original question before that was if most people should be like what you asked me what's wrong with the vegan diet in general, right? So
Yeah.
the reason I brought that up is because those people that I see at these markets, they're getting this vitamin content in their diet regardless of what else they're getting. They're sticking to their traditional roots of getting those nutrients. So there might actually be the reason I'm bringing this up because those people that I see in these markets, from my opinion, would be healthier than a vegan because they're getting these high vitamin animal foods. And
Okay. Well, this isn't just about vitamins. Like the macronutrient content of the diet also matters, and I know we disagree on this, but saturated fat and cholesterol is definitely linked to heart disease. It is linked to diabetes, certain forms of cancer. There are also like things like heme iron that increase disease risks. So I think you're focusing too much on vitamins. And if you actually look at the recent data, vegans don't really have high rates of vitamin or mineral
but
deficiencies. I
I
just
just
linked in
don't like
chat.
I,
Well, wait a second. I just linked in chat a study that came out of Switzerland recently. Micronutrient status and intake in omnivores, vegetarians, and vegans in Switzerland. Vegans didn't really have any higher rates of deficiencies. I think the one thing they did have higher rates of deficiencies in was zinc. But again, like that can just be dealt with just from, being conscious of the food choices you're making.
I mean, the two problems I have with that are the whole saturated fat and cholesterol thing you're saying contribute to heart disease. I feel like you just need to add in the context of what most Americans are eating, not just those two things in general. And then the second thing of vegans not having nutritional deficiencies, the RDA for vitamin D and is like 400. What is it? And like the actual nanograms per liter spectrum of vitamin D is from like 20 to 100. And like 20 is like you've never been in the sun before, and 100 is like you're about to die from a vitamin D overdose. So, uh, like the problem with modern nutritional methods in determining deficiencies, that's not necessarily indicative of what optimal health is, and that's glaringly obvious with I know vitamin D3. I know in a lot of cases, like calcium is too high as well. Those are two things that are accepted to not be correct for RDA. So to go with RDA for me is difficult to
Well, they didn't
say.
just go like they looked at micronutrient intakes in the study and also status. So, vegans didn't have any higher rates of like clinical deficiencies. Um, you also said like you have to take things into context, like with the heart disease and cholesterol thing. Well, again, you linked a study on the Maasai in Africa, and they had extremely high rates of heart disease, and that's what you'd consider to be an ideal diet, quote unquote. So
But we
even
have to keep, like you saying heart disease, but we have to keep in mind when we say heart disease, we mean these Maasai had pretty much they're exceptions to the disease because of the way their arteries adapted and their lifestyle.
Well, no, they had high prevalence of the disease, but mortality from the disease was quite low. And as far as the researchers could tell, it was because their arteries opened up or something
Yeah, I mean
as
that's
as they
kind of
got older.
we need to like since we don't know these specifics and these things about this disease in the context of those people, I don't think we should just like speculate and say that and just say that heart disease does this without clarifying those things about these people that consume these foods.
Okay, well, the thing is, even under ideal circumstances, it's like what you would consider ideal circumstances. Things like saturated fat and cholesterol uh, do cause atherosclerosis, clogging of the arteries, plaque buildup. It's just in that one example you gave, like the Maasai, it didn't result in increased mortality from heart disease or non-significant increase. It's like disproportionately.
I just don't want to dwell on this too much because like
Yeah,
those were like a
I
lot of
get
these studies were like just things I came up
I
with on the
get what you're
spot.
saying, but I mean, your ethical, like your perspective on ethics keeps going back to nutrition. And it's quite clear that vegans can get all the nutrition they need. They can live long, healthy lives. So I'm just wondering why you'd think like somebody should just needlessly kill animals when they
Because
can
to me,
just
it's not
live
clear
healthy.
because I was on a vegan diet for like a couple weeks and I don't know if that
Well,
was long enough of a measurement, but it wasn't even comparable to this diet.
Well, again, that's an anecdotal claim. You only did it for several weeks. You
Hmm.
might be an outlier in some sort of way. You might have some other underlying problem. Like among the general population, it's clear that people can be totally healthy, get all the nutrition they need. The American Dietetics Association released a peer-reviewed report saying vegan diets are healthful, adequate for all stages of life, pregnancy, adulthood, even suitable for athletes. Like, this is well understood and established that vegan diets are nutritionally adequate, healthy, and they even prevent against chronic disease. So I'm still just confused why you wouldn't say, unless you have some sort of weird specific health problem like me, you should eat a vegan diet.
Because my whole understanding of this diet and the reason I got into the carnivore diet, it has nothing to do with meat or animals or anything. It had to do with I started researching like what the healthiest diet was and what the bioavailability of nutrients was, and to my understanding, uh, and how I've anecdotally felt and a lot of things I've noticed, it's imperative that I get these vitamins in my diet in certain amounts to feel optimally healthy.
Okay,
That's
well,
my
that's just for you though.
I mean, I think I would say that as a blanket statement to anyone. They need X amount of these vitamins to be in optimal health, not just avoid deficiencies.
Right, okay. And there's no evidence that vegans can't get an ideal amount of nutrition.
No, that's why I don't really argue on this point too much because my whole theory of fat soluble vitamins being the most important thing in regards to health and development is not something that uh, people generally accept or care about as like they don't place much of an importance on it as I do. That's why it doesn't really sound like my point of view makes sense to you.
Right, so assuming vegans can get an adequate amount of nutrition, like for ideal health, you'd recommend that everyone follow that diet if they could?
I said that already, man. I said
Okay.
if my function was the exact same as a vegan's was, which I mean in my experience it hasn't been, then I would do it. But that's
Okay, and you would recommend that sort of thing for vast majority of people if they could stay healthy or be healthier on a vegan
if
diet.
they could, yeah,
Okay.
under that condition.
Okay. I think that's a good point to end it there. Yeah, if you have any closing thoughts or whatever you wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't really want to just touch on. I don't know how much of importance this was to just how most people do the carnivore diet or anything specifically in regards to that. I
Well,
don't
I mean,
really.
most people do the carnivore diet pretty terribly. Like I've mentioned this before, but they're
Yeah,
not eating organ meats, and it very clearly is a fad diet the way it's being like marketed.
you mean like
Uh,
there's like the ribeye steak every day? That's it.
Yeah, basically. Like the way it's being marketed, it is a fad diet for like short-term weight loss. It's not something you should follow long-term. And even if you're doing it properly, quote unquote, eating like organs, thalamus glands, shit like that to get things like vitamin C, it's still terrible for your health. You
Yeah,
should
man,
eat.
I'm doing a video later. It's amazing how almost every organ is incredibly high in vitamin C. But uh, even in that context, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that unfortunately the people that got popular with the carnivore diet are pretty much doing it in the kind of like the worst way possible. Do you think if it wasn't like an eat steak all day diet and that people weren't so ingrained in that like kind of like closed minded mindset of not wanting to, and it's a cultural thing too, people don't really want to eat those foods and go out to get them and do the things that I do. You think, I mean, we'd probably be having a much different conversation if that was the case or not. Maybe it wouldn't have even, I mean, probably if that was the case, if that was the diet, it would have never been popular in the first place, right?
No. Like again, and that's how like you can tell, it's very clearly a fad diet that's just gonna go out of fashion in a few months. It's just appealing to our culture sensibilities where you're not really eating any organ meats. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
steak and like, oh, steak is fun food.
Mm-hmm. I'm very against that myself, but would you say that keto is a fad diet?
Yeah, it really is. Some people do well on ketogenic diets. Like, it can treat epilepsy and shit. You can do a vegan keto diet, by the way. It's just that,
Yeah, I'm familiar with
like,
that. Yeah.
the only real benefit is for people who suffer from epileptic seizures and people who have a really hard time with caloric control. Otherwise, there's really no benefit to the diet. It's not good for reducing heart disease risk, not good for diabetes. I'd say it's not even good for cancer just because the amount of
But
fat.
my problem is with that. What you're saying is when I go on, the vegan forum and I look at things, it's a lot about animal rights, and then occasionally someone smells because they fart too much. And then when I go on the keto forum, it just seems to be all people that have had these miraculous weight loss stories. People talk about reversing their diabetes. People talk about
Well, again,
how
these are anecdotal claims. I don't really care about people posting in a forum.
but literally on in the context of the ketogenic diet, with just the sheer amount of anecdotes that come up every single day
Well,
is
you can find that stuff in the vegan community too. Like you don't have to look
uh,
far. It's like these anecdotal claims don't really mean anything.
but the prevalence of them and
Also you have to consider like they're anecdotal claims. Like okay, well, like my diabetes got better. I lost weight. All this crap. I feel better. Well, what's like? Show me like actual numbers here.
Mhm.
um, like again, just saying I don't have to take diabetes medication, that doesn't actually mean you've improved your diabetes. You can eliminate symptoms of diabetes by eating a zero carbohydrate diet. Your glucose levels won't shoot up and you won't need to take those medications because your glucose is down. But has your insulin sensitivity actually improved? Not necessarily. Usually when people lose weight, it improves, but again, like a really high fat diet, particularly high in saturated fat, it's not going to improve insulin sensitivity unless it's in the context of weight loss. But in that situation, weight loss is what improved insulin
I mean,
sensitivity, and not the diet.
caloric restriction too.
Yeah.
But what do you think? And I think this is a big problem that doesn't really get said enough in the context of vegan diets when people don't really understand what, like a lot of people will go vegan and do all these things and they'll start seeing their health deteriorate because they don't understand things that they need to supplement and various foods they should be eating. And it just gets to a point where like a year or two into the diet, they're literally like almost wasting away because of their lack of knowledge of the diet. Do you think there needs to be like more of an importance in what vegans need to do to be healthy on a vegan diet?
Well, I think the majority of people are saying they're wasting away. They're just not eating enough. And in that
Mhm.
circumstance, I just say weigh your food, track your calories. If you're having a hard time eating a high volume of food, just eat more fat. Just like peanut butter, avocados, even like coconuts.
Mhm. I mean, for some people, especially like the vegan diet with a lot of the different foods people buy in the food volume and I mean, it's same thing with the carnivore diet. Like for people to just go to the supermarket and buy steaks, that's easy. But when they start having to, buy all these different foods, isn't there like a level of effort into doing a proper vegan diet that you think might require like a bit more research and time and effort that some people are willing to do?
Well, here's the thing, like, there's a lot of animal products where you generally get your nutrition from, like, milk in Canada is probably the biggest source of vitamin D because it's artificially fortified. Dairy and salt is also the biggest source of iodine because iodine's added to dairy and table salt. So there's these important nutrients that you need that you'd normally get from like dairy or salt or something like that. And then when you switch to a vegan diet, if you're not getting those vitamins or minerals from the foods you're switching to, like I don't think there's any iodine in soy milk. Well, that can be a problem. You know, so you do kind of need to know a little bit about this stuff, but generally, I think for most people, just have a diet that has a lot of like lentils, beans, legumes, some grains, a mix of fruits and vegetables, and I definitely say supplement B12, vitamin D. That's usually good for most people, and sometimes you do need to make sure you get enough iodine if you're not adding sodium to your diet. So you might want to eat sea vegetables or take an iodine supplement, but it doesn't take too much effort. It's just that, some people just don't realize these issues they can run into.
Yeah, but I mean, like, aren't you concerned about people like celebrities and very popular people? Like, they go vegan, they don't really do it right, and then people find out they're not vegan anymore. That seems to have been happening a
Yeah,
little bit lately.
yeah, like that really annoys me. I forget her name now. The woman who played Catwoman in the last Batman movie.
It's
She
not.
said she was
It's not
huh?
guilt. I don't want to say it. I'm probably wrong.
In the last like the last in the trilogy I forget her name, but
That was a
Anne
while ago,
Hathaway.
right? Though. Oh, Anne
Anne
Hathaway.
Hathaway,
Oh.
yeah. She said she was vegan, and then like she wrote she had an interview with someone, and it was really stupid. She said she was only eating tofu and chickpeas, like literally that's it. And then she said, I just didn't feel well, so I had to quit veganism. It's like there's more than tofu and chickpeas. So there's a lot of people who I don't know, like maybe they just don't think about what they eat and literally just hear on some blog, oh, you need to eat chickpeas and tofu to get enough protein or else you'll die, and they just do that and then they fail. So yeah, there's those weird, odd like outliers, but I think most people have enough common sense to just eat a sensible vegan diet, like have some beans, potatoes, rice, and have a mix of vegetables and fruits, and maybe take like a multivitamin, and they generally do fine.
I
But
mean, but what I've noticed is those people that you're mentioning, like right now, that are successful on those vegan diets, they tend to have, they put a pretty extensive amount of work into their pantry, into the foods they have. I guess it might just be something that people aren't
I
really
never
willing
really
to.
have like what I eat, like lentils, tofu, just some nori wraps and shit every day, and
But
like
the reason I brought that
broccoli
up
and
is
some
because what
fruit.
do you think about, like, I don't know if you've seen their videos, like Hench Herbivore has like a million powders in these jars and stuff, and like
Yeah, sure.
Ascendant
Yeah. Like, I
Nutrition
mean,
does
there's
kind of the
people who
same
do
thing.
that.
Yeah.
You don't really need to.
Hmm.
I think my diet is a lot of people like criticize me for that. Like when I do what I eat in a day vlogs, they're like, "Wow, dude, you eat really fucking boring."
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I just cook up plain lentils, maybe put some hot sauce and some nutritional yeast on it, eat
Hmm.
it. That's a meal for me. Like it's very simple and straightforward. I think people kind of overcomplicate things a bit too much.
Do you think there's a problem with people, like there tends to be like almost like a cookie cutter kind of a lot of foods that people tend to eat in their diet, whether it's avocado or tahini or certain green vegetable, like big giant green vegetable shakes that have, certain, a lot of these foods when consumed in large amounts frequently, like are there anti-nutrient concerns for people that aren't really soaking or preparing these foods properly?
No, generally that's not an issue. What for things like broccoli, tofu, that it inhibits iodine absorption. Like there's phytates in beans and shit that supposedly inhibit iron absorption. Your body makes metabolic adaptations to these things where they don't actually affect you. And in the case of things like tofu and broccoli, you can just eat more iodine if it inhibits iodine absorption. Normally, this sort of thing isn't an issue for people, but maybe with like higher intakes of certain things, it can be a problem. But again, it's easily fixed.
No, man, that sounds good. I just had those few questions in regards to the vegan
Yeah,
stuff. Is there
sure.
anything else we wanted to touch on?
No, I think I just wanted to summarize things. Like basically, there's no indication to me that a vegan diet like is harmful to health. It only has benefits. I think it's really the way people should be eating, and there's every indication that diets that are high in saturated fat, cholesterol, animal products massively increase chronic disease risk. And we see this in every single population, even like pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers like the Maasai you mentioned. The rates of disease are very high. It's just that, you know, the rates in which they die from these diseases might be low because of other confounding factors. But in modern society, with the way we're living, it's very clear that these foods increase risk of death from these diseases.
Yeah, I mean, if there's, I guess, that was a very short summary for the amount of time we've been talking, and there's definitely been some back and forth on each of those points. So I guess if people want specific details, most of that stuff was talked about in the first like 2.5 hours or so, 2 hours.
Yeah.
Still a pretty long period of time, but the initially we went back and forth a lot on the, what was it, the just the heart disease in general, right? The arterial, went back and forth on that for about an hour. Then we moved on to the heme iron thing for about an hour, pretty much. And then we kind of just summarized the vitamins were thrown in between there, um, not really too much to speculate on. We just kind of speculated on bioavailability a little bit. And then we spoke about just kind of moved into the ethical side of things, and just kind of how people are not really, they just, I mean, that's how America is, unfortunately, with the whole food production system, and just how a lot of other places in the world are kind of slowly creeping towards it at the moment.
Okay, sure. So thanks for having the debate. It definitely went better than some other ones I had recently. So yeah, thanks for being on. I'll link your channel in the description of this video. I'm also going to re-upload the live stream to my main channel once it's done processing. And if you want to upload this debate to your channel, you can just download it from me.
Like Clip Converter. Yeah, just
Yeah.
download it. Okay.
Okay, cool. So thanks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the debate.